Hey friends, about 70% of folks watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know where you're tuning in from. I never should have gone up to that cabin, but I needed to get away from the noise of the city, from the financial troubles that kept me up at night, and most of all, from my own restless thoughts. As a lifelong resident of Chicago, I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. I much preferred my creature comforts, watching the Cubs game with a cold beer, shooting pool with the guys from work, maybe taking my motorcycle out for a weekend ride. But lately, those simple pleasures had lost their appeal. No matter how many extra shifts I picked up driving for Uber, I just couldn't seem to get ahead. The bills kept piling up and my dreams of opening my own mechanic shop seemed more distant than ever. I was barely making rent on my cramped studio apartment. Something had to change. That's when my buddy Steve mentioned his family's old hunting cabin a few hours north, deep in the Wisconsin woods. He hadn't been up there in years and said I could use it any time, no charge. A free place to stay where I could clear my head and figure things out. I jumped at the chance. I borrowed some old camping gear, loaded up my Toyota Camry, and hit the road out of Chicago, eager to put some distance between myself and my problems. Little did I know I was driving straight towards something far worse. The woods around the cabin were dense and still the summer foliage so thick it seemed to swallow the dirt access road. I hadn't seen another car for miles by the time I arrived and lugged my supplies inside the dusty, bare bone shelter. The sun was already sinking below the tree line. Too exhausted to gather firewood or figure out the ancient propane stove, I ate a few granola bars, chugged some water, and collapsed into the musty cot. The scratchy wool blanket made my skin itch, but I was too tired to care. My city life already felt a world away. Through the grimy windows, the darkening forest kept watch over the tiny cabin. An owl hooted in the distance. Tree branches cast jagged, grasping shadows across the walls. Crickets and cicadas buzzed in a rising chorus. I didn't know it yet, but something else lurked in those woods. Something that would make me regret ever coming here. As I drifted off to an uneasy sleep, a twig snapped loudly in the woods nearby. I startled awake, then strained to hear anything else, but all was quiet. Probably just a squirrel or deer, I reassured myself, already slipping back into slumber. If only I'd known how wrong I was. An eerie howling jolted me from a fitful sleep. It sounded like no animal I'd ever heard before. A guttural, almost human-like wail that made my hair stand on end. My heart was pounding. I waited for the cry to come again, but the night stayed silent. A wolf. A coyote. They didn't sound like that, did they? Wide awake now, I noticed the woods felt different, charged with a crackling energy and deathly still. No soothing insect songs, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating, oppressive quiet. Shivering despite the stuffy heat, I burrowed deeper into the cot, suddenly wishing I was back in my dumpy apartment. I must have eventually drifted off because when I opened my eyes again, pale dawn light filtered through the dusty windows. Though I hadn't had a drop of alcohol in weeks, my head throbbed like the morning after a bender. Every joint ached. Stumbling to the kitchen tap, I splashed water on my face and tried to shake off the unreasonable dread clouding my mind. Coffee. I needed coffee. Rummaging through the old cabinets, I found a tin of grounds that smelled stale but not rancid, better than nothing. While the ancient percolator burbled and hissed on the propane stove, I stepped outside to clear the cobwebs. The bright morning sun did little to chase away the wood's ominous aura. An unnatural hush still blanketed the forest, broken only by the occasional distant bird call. Towering pines and gnarled oaks stretched in every direction, dense underbrush overtaking the forest floor below, no obvious paths in or out. Unease prickled my skin as I realized how isolated I was out here. miles from the nearest town or main road, with no cell service. What was I thinking, coming to this remote place alone? I shook my head. I was being ridiculous. This was exactly what I needed: solitude, peace and quiet, a chance to reset. Steve used to come up here all the time, and he was fine. Back inside, I savored the brew's rich aroma as I sipped the strong black coffee. Unpacking my meager groceries, I assembled a quick breakfast and went over my agenda for this little retreat. I'd hike around a bit, try to relax, maybe do some journaling and soul-searching, take stock of my life, and figure out a plan B. Now that my mechanic shop dreams had stalled out, a sudden blow against the door made me spill my coffee with a yelp. I stared at the door, pulse racing, listening hard. Another thud landed, followed by heavy shuffling and snuffling. "Hello," I croaked, my mouth bone dry. "Is someone out there?" An inch toward the door, fighting the urge to scramble back into a far corner and hide, hefting the cast iron skillet for the stove. I gripped the doorknob with a sweaty palm. I silently counted to 3, heart in my throat, then flung the door wide. The rusted hinges shrieked in protest. I brandished the skillet with a strangled battle cry, but the weathered boards of the small porch were empty. No sign of any creature, just a wall of trees and the same suffocating silence. Then my eyes fell on the tracks. Unlike any animal Prince had ever seen, they were massive, easily as long as my size 13 boots. The shape almost looked human-like, but with vicious claws instead of toes. A chill rolled through me, despite the warm sun. What in the hell could have made those? After that, my pulse slowed to a less thunderous pace. I examined the strange prints more closely. Each footprint, if you could call them, sank deep into the soft loam edging the cabin. Definitely fresh. I swallowed hard, casting a wary glance at the too quiet forest. I was no wilderness expert, but I camped and hiked enough to recognize most animal tracks common to the upper Midwest. Wolf, bear, deer, coyote. These looked like none of those. The unsettling fusion of human and animal characteristics made my stomach churn. I stood and turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadowed gaps between the trees for any signs of the creature. But other than the uncanny silence, the woods looked perfectly ordinary, still sun-dappled and green. Maybe this was all some prank, a ploy by the locals to scare gullible city slickers. An uneasy laugh escaped me at the thought. No way, those tracks were too large, too real to be fake. Something was out there, but what? I shook my head sharply, dispelling the eerie train of thought. Determined to shake off the willies, I marched back inside to pack a day pack and hit the trails. A brisk hike and some fresh air would clear the irrational fears clouding my head. The path, an overgrown logging road, meandered through towering oaks and hickories, a verdant tunnel pierced by dusty sunbeams. The forest felt almost supernaturally hushed, muffled, like a physical weight against my eardrums. My boots crunched on the dirt, and my slightly labored breathing sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. Twig-thin branches snatched at my clothes, rocks turned underfoot, threatening a twisted ankle. Nettles and thorns scratched any exposed skin. The hostile woods seemed to resent my presence, working to expel me as a living body rejects an infection. Each minute dragged like an hour, and I pushed myself faster, suddenly craving the cabin's meager safety. I stumbled into the clearing around noon, sweat-soaked and scratched to hell, nearly weeping with relief at the shabby little shelter. I'd only been walking a couple of hours, but it felt like days. I made a beeline for the water pump, never so grateful for the tepid iron-rich flow. That's when I saw them, more of those eerie half-human footprints stamped in the muddy patch around the pump. A trail of them led directly to the cabin door, but that was impossible. I'd been walking in the opposite direction all morning. Ice lodged in my gut as the horrible realization struck. The prints were fresh. Something had been right here at this cabin. While I was away, I staggered back, my heel catching on a root, sending me sprawling painfully onto my back, gasping. I stared at the brilliant blue sky overhead, a jigsaw puzzle of leaves. My heart jackhammered against my ribs. What if the creature was still here, watching me even now from the green shadows? I had to get away, get to my car, drive until I found cell service and could call the police, and tell them what exactly they'd think I'd lost my mind. Hell, maybe I had. My problems in Chicago suddenly seemed laughably tame compared to whatever horror was stalking these woods. If I survived this, I swore I'd never take my crappy studio apartment for granted again. On quivering legs, I pushed to my feet, never taking my eyes off the tree line. The cabin loomed behind me, no longer a refuge, but a trap waiting to be sprung. I got inside just long enough to grab my keys and wallet, and I'd kiss this nightmarish forest goodbye forever, but I never made it that far. One step, two steps toward the cabin, shadow detached from the woods to my left, pacing me. Another joined from the right, moving far too fluidly and quietly to be human. My breath caught in my chest, paralyzing me ever so slowly. I turned my head, already knowing what I would see, but still disbelieving. They emerged from the tree line on all fours, wolf-like in shape and posture, but too broad, too muscular to be true wolves. As they prowled closer, slaver dripping from their muzzles, their features came into sharper focus. And I finally saw what they really were, or rather, what they had once been. Their limbs were grotesquely elongated, jointed at odd angles, masses of scar tissue and fused skin with fur like a taxidermist's half-finished creations. Jaws stretched into protruding snouts lined with jagged fangs, clawed half-human hands flexed, sinking into the loam. But worst of all were their eyes, glowing red yet achingly, nauseatingly human. Their scream worked its way up my dry throat, emerging as a cracked wheeze. "What are you?" I chucked out, knowing I wouldn't like the answer. The nearest beast lifted its head and grinned. A rasping, barking laughter shook its frame. "We are the price," it growled in a voice never meant to issue from a human mouth, "and you, trespasser, are our prey." The creatures began to circle me, moving with sinister grace, both animal and human. My legs shook so hard I could barely stay upright. Cold sweat plastered my shirt to my back. A sour taste flooded my mouth. P-price, prey. I don't understand. My words emerged thin and thready with panic. I didn't mean to trespass. I'll leave, I'll go now and never come back. I swear. The leader, the one who had spoken, shook its great shaggy head. Amusement glinted in those glowing red eyes, a terribly human expression in the canine face. "Oh, you'll never leave. You'll pay the price, as all do who dare enter our forest, just as we did long ago." I shuddered both from the threat and the eerie intelligence in its gaze. Dear God, there was no reasoning with these things. They weren't just animals, but they weren't human either, not anymore. And they meant to kill me. I glanced toward the cabin, gauging my odds of making it inside before they pounced. As if reading my intentions, the leader tensed, coiling to spring. I braced myself to bolt, knowing I would almost certainly die in the attempt, but I never got the chance. In a blur of teeth and fur and claws, the creature launched itself at me faster than my eyes could follow. I flung my arms up with a strangled cry, stumbling back. White-hot pain tore across my chest as its claws opened my flesh like knives through paper. The force of the blow knocked me off my feet. I crashed in the dirt, gasping. Warm blood soaked my shirt. The metallic reek mingled with the beast's thick musk reeking of carrion. The leader loomed over me, its breath fetid in my face. My heart hammered a staccato beat. Terror. Sweat stung my eyes. I knew I had only seconds to live, and that it would be neither quick nor painless. But damn if I'd just lie down and die for these freakish things. Groping blindly, my fingers closed over a large rock half buried in the soil. I swung with every ounce of strength I had left, cracking the beast across the muzzle. It yelped more startled than hurt, but the blow bought me a precious second, shoving its bulk off me. I rolled and scrambled to my feet, leaving a smear of blood on the ground. The other creature snarled and surged forward at my movement. I snatched up a dead branch, brandishing it before me like a club, and staggered toward the cabin. If I could just get inside, maybe I could hold them off or escape out a window. The pack rallied swiftly, cutting off my route. I swung the branch in wide arcs, trying to keep them at bay, but they dodged with infuriating ease. They harried me from all sides, forcing me away from the cabin and any hope of refuge. Step by stumbling step, they backed me toward the woods, preparing for the kill. The leader locked its horrible red eyes on mine, unholy glee shining in their depths. I could almost hear the human mind that used to inhabit the body screaming alongside my own. Was this how those men had felt before the forest claimed them? This overwhelming despair, this animalistic terror in the face of an inevitable end. The rough bark of a tree trunk scraped my back, halting my retreat. Nowhere to run, the creature's tensed fangs bared. My vision swam black around the edges. So this was how I died. Alone, hunted and afraid. In an evil forest I never should have entered. As the beast lunged for my throat, I closed my eyes. My last defiant thought, a silent apology to my family for my stupidity. At least my end would be quick, but it wasn't my time after all. A thunderous boom shattered the glade's eerie silence. The lead creature jerked mid-leap as if punched, suspended almost comically in the air for a single heartbeat. Then it crashed to the ground and lay still with a bloody hole blown through its misshapen skull. The other beasts whipped toward the sound, their lips curling back from blood-stained fangs. I sagged against the tree trunk, my knees weak with relief and confusion. "What the hell just happened?" "Get down, son." Now a gruff, authoritative shout, followed by another deafening retort. The second creature yelped and thrashed in alone. Still dazed, I dropped into a crouch, clutching white-knuckled at my makeshift club. From the corner of my eye I saw him, a tall, weather-beaten man in faded flannel and scuffed boots, lowering a smoking rifle from his shoulder. He looked to be in his 60s. His face was a crag of lines and sunspots under a battered baseball cap. Keen blue eyes flashed as he stepped into the clearing, ejecting spent shell casings with deft motions. "Didn't anyone ever teach you not to hike these woods alone, boy? Especially not after what happened before." He spoke almost conversationally as he sent another round through a lunging beast's heart. The creature crumpled almost at my feet. I scrambled back with a strangled cry. "Who are you?" I crowed. "Name's Bill. I'm the groundskeeper around these parts." He fired again and another creature fell still. Its snarls silenced forever. And you're damn lucky I was out checking my traps today, or these mongrels would have ripped you to ribbons. I stared dumbly at the gore-streaked old man, unsure which was more shocking. His casual demeanor or his deadly aim. You knew these things were out here. What the hell are they? He'll explain later. We got him out before the rest of the pack comes sniffing around. Bill extended a gnarled hand, holding me to my feet with surprising strength. His eyes fell on my blood-soaked shirt and he frowned. "You hurt bad?" "No, I don't think so," I stammered. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me lightheaded and queasy. Bill grunted and slung my arm over his shoulders, half dragging me in the direction he'd come from. We crashed through the underbrush for several tense minutes, Bill pausing every so often to scan the trees and sniff the air. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing, dominated by a ramshackle hunting blind. He hustled me up the rickety ladder and through the door, which he barred securely. Behind us in the corner sat an ancient radio set, a kerosene lantern, and a dusty first aid kit that looked like a relic from the Korean War. Bill shoved me down onto a wooden crate and began rifling through the kit. "Get that shirt off and let's see what we're dealing with," he ordered. I obeyed with shaking hands, hissing in pain as the fabric peeled away from the lacerations on my chest. Bill cleaned and bandaged the wounds with brusque efficiency, ignoring my winces and muttered curses. So he began conversationally taping a final piece of gauze into place. "I reckon you got questions. About 1,000. Yeah, I glared at him, my shock slowly hardening into anger, starting with what in God's name those things are and why the hell nobody warned me about them. Bill sighed and settled back on his haunches, lacing his fingers over his stomach. Folks around here call them bar guests, bloodthirsty critters, not quite wolf nor man. Legend has it they're the vengeful spirits of men who died badly in these woods. I swallowed hard, remembering the horrible human intelligence in those red eyes. How could something like that even exist? It's impossible, son. When you've been in these hills as long as I have, you learn the impossible ain't quite what it seems. Bill scratched his jaw thoughtfully. That's the way I heard it. A bunch of fellas from the city came up here years back to do some hunting. Well, they wasn't after deer, though. A chill traced my spine. The man's eyes had gone distant, seeing into a dark past. Nobody knows quite what happened. Poachers, harvesting game off-season maybe, or something worse. All's clear is there was an accident with their guns. More than one man got shot bad. In these woods, well, they got a long memory for spilled blood. Bill shook his head grimly. Folks say dying soaked in fear and pain. It changes a man, twists him up with the wild dark till he ain't hardly human no more. Most hunters never made it home, but something sure walked out of this forest wearing their skins. Something unnatural and hungry for revenge on any soul unlucky enough to cross its path. I stared at him in horror, seeing again the grotesque fusion of human and beast fur and scar. Bile scorched the back of my throat. Bill nodded, slowly acknowledging the awful truth. Yep, that's what you ran afoul of today. Boy, the bar guests don't take kindly to strangers in their woods, especially not after what was done to him. You're just lucky I've been tracking their movements and preparing for an ambush. He patted the butt of his rifle almost fondly. I had the sickening sense this was far from the first time he'd put it to such use. My head spun with the enormity of it all, that such evil could not only exist but be accepted as just another hazard of these hills. Bill must have read the numb shock on my face. He reached out and gripped my shoulder, his calloused palm rough against my skin. Now you listen to me, son. I know you're scared and hurting and this ain't nothing you was ever trained for. But you gotta dig deep and find that steel in your spine. You here 'cause this fight ain't over, not by a long shot. I met his hard stare, seeing my own disbelief and terror reflected in his faded blue eyes. But behind that, like a baked fire, glowed a steely resolve. This old man had been battling the bar guests for years. I suddenly realized, decades maybe. He was still standing, still holding the line between their savagery and the unsuspecting world. If he could do that, then maybe I could make it through this night. Maybe I could survive to see the sunrise and leave this shadowed, stinking forest once and for all. Not as a beast's next meal, but as a man who had faced true horror and lived. Taking a deep breath, I nodded slowly. Okay. I hear you. My voice cracked and I swallowed thickly. What do we do now? How do we make it out of here? Bill smiled then, a slash of grim humor, utterly devoid of joy. Well, he drawled, heaving himself to his feet with a creak of joints. That's the trick, ain't it? I reckon step one is not dying. Think you can handle that part, son? I laughed, a brutal sound too close to hysteria. But I pushed shakily to my feet beside him, meeting his eyes without flinching. Yeah, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. Yeah, I can handle that. The old man nodded approvingly and turned to the door, unbarring it with a screech of rusted metal. Beyond the waiting words whispered a voiceless greeting, dark and eager, and together we stepped out to meet it. The sun had sunk below the tree line by the time Bill and I emerged from the blind, painting the forest in shades of menacing shadow. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig underfoot made me flinch and reach instinctively for a weapon. I didn't have anything. Bill seemed to sense my building panic. Deep breath, son. They hunt mostly by smell. Long as you keep downwind and move quiet, we've got a chance. I nodded tightly, trying to steady my galloping heart. We crept through the underbrush in single file, Bill on point with his rifle, while I stumbled along behind him, senses straining. Sweat plastered my shirt to my back, despite the evening chill. How far was it to the cabin? To my car? 10 minutes hike seemed to stretch into hours when every shadow concealed monstrous hulking shapes waiting to pounce. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, stalked like a wounded deer. I prayed silently, promising any deity who would listen that if I made it out of here alive, I'd never set foot in the wilderness again. A branch cracked like a gunshot somewhere off to our left. I whirled with a gasp as Bill's outstretched hand halted my panic flight. He raised a warning finger to his lips, scanning the trees with narrowed eyes. Another branch popped, and another. The noises circled us slowly, tightening like a noose. A low, eager whine drifted from the darkness, raising every hair on my body. They've caught our scent. Paul's voice was low and taut. Get ready to run. What I stammered. But the rest of my questions stuck in my throat because the shadows between the trees had come alive, boiling with dark, slinking shapes and glowing red eyes. Run, Bill roared. I'm right behind you, he said. Go. I ran, crashing blindly through strangling brush and snatching thorns. My pulse was a deafening drum in my ears. Baying howls shattered the night at my back, spurring me faster. Bill's rifle boomed once, twice, 3 times, yelps of pain mingled with snarls of fury. I didn't look back, couldn't, or the sheer horror of what pursued me would paralyze me to the spot. I fixed my eyes forward, searching desperately for the cabin's weathered slats or my car's rusted bumper. My foot snagged an exposed root, and I went down hard, skidding in the damp mulch. The wind knocked from my lungs in a grunt. I struggled to rise, but heavy weight slammed me back to the earth. Putrid breath washed over the back of my neck as a rumbling growl vibrated through my spine. I twisted my head to the side and found myself staring straight into a bar guest's terrible face. It was drooling, its muzzle inches from mine. I screamed a thin, cracked sound that belonged to a child, not a grown man. The creature's jaws gaped, rimmed in blood-stained fangs. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the pain, the rending and tearing as it ripped out my throat. The boom of Bill's rifle split the air above my head. The bar guest jerked as the bullet tore through its skull in a spray of bone chips and gore. Its full weight collapsed on me, and I heaved desperately at the twitching mass of matted fur and leathery skin. Bill appeared above me like an avenging angel, yanking the carcass clear with one hand and dragging me up with the other. Blood streaked his face and his shirt hung in tatters, but his eyes gleamed with manic focus. No time to catch your breath, boy. They're coming back around. I staggered upright, my lungs searing. The night pulsed with the pack's eager howls, drawing closer by the second. We plunged into the trees once more, crashing heedlessly through the undergrowth. There was no attempt at stealth now, only flight. A primal pounding urge to escape, survive, live. My sides ached and vicious stitches stabbed my ribs. Just when I thought my overtaxed legs would give out, we broke through a wall of foliage into a blessedly familiar clearing. And there, looking just as I'd left it a lifetime ago, squatted my family's ancient cabin. And just beyond it, glinting dully in the moonlight, was my equally ancient Toyota Camry. I could have wept at the sight. Beside me, Bill skidded to a halt, panting, and raised his rifle once more. "Get to the car," he snapped. Bill hauled him off. There didn't need to be told twice. I pelted across the clearing, gravel spraying beneath my boots. Throwing my hand into my pocket for the keys, a jolt of pure electric relief surged through me as my fingers closed over their reassuring ridges. I was going to make it. I was going to survive this nightmare. Already, my mind spun ahead, visualizing the police station where I'd babble out my story. The reporters who would dismiss it all as another backwoods tall tale, the stiff drink and hot shower waiting at home. All these thoughts flashed through my head in the fleeting seconds it took to yank open the door and fling myself behind the wheel. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. I twisted in my seat, one hand poised to throw the car into gear and gun the accelerator. "Bill," I screamed. "Come on, let's go." But it was too late. The bored guests boiled out of the trees like a dark tide, their howls deafening. For a single suspended breath, all I could see was the stark silhouette of the old man against the night sky and the ravaging horde descending upon him. Then they hit like a wave against a levee that has stood too long. A bulwark never meant to last. They dragged Bill down in a writhing tangle of limbs and fangs and terrible human screams. His rifle boomed again and again until, abruptly, shockingly, it fell silent. I must have cried out. I must have released some thin, wordless keen of horror and grief. But I couldn't hear it over the roaring in my ears, the hammer of my own heart. Some final vestige of sanity screamed at me to move, to flee this place of blood and shadow and never look back. My foot found the accelerator. The car surged forward in a spray of dirt and leaves. The last thing I saw before the woods swallowed the clearing was the twitching, unrecognizable ruin that had been Bill, a man who saved my life at the cost of his own, and crouched over him, their eyes like burning coals. The bird guests watching me go in the years since that night have never returned to those woods. I moved far away to a new city and a new life. I don't drive much anymore, never on dark country roads. I avoid the wilderness content with manicured parks and well-lit paths because I know with a bone-deep certainty that they're still out there waiting, watching the price, eternally stalking the forest that made them eager to claim any foolish enough to enter their domain. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night when sleep eludes me, I fancy I hear them howling and laughing and calling me back to the shadows. I barely escaped back to the fates. I left Bill to bleeding in the black woods. They'll never let me forget, and God help me, I never can. I'd always been drawn to the solitude and serenity of the deep woods. Living in the bustling city of Chicago, dealing with the stress of my accounting job and the constant pressure to make ends meet, I often dreamed of escaping to a place where the only sounds were the whispers of the wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. So when I saw the ad for the remote cabin tucked away in the vast wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I knew I had to go. I'd been saving up for a while, putting a little aside from each paycheck in hopes of taking a much-needed break from the grind of urban life, and with autumn settling in, the timing seemed perfect. I packed up my old SUV with enough supplies to last me a couple weeks. Non-perishable food, bottled water, warm clothing, and some basic camping gear. The drive from Chicago was long, almost 8 hours, but as the miles ticked by, I could feel the stress and tension slowly melting away, replaced by a growing sense of excitement and adventure. By the time I reached the small town nearest to the cabin, dusk was already painting the sky in deep purples and blues. I stopped at the local general store to pick up the cabin keys from the owner, an old-timer named Hank. "You sure you want to head out there all by yourself?" Hank asked, eyeing me curiously as he handed over the keys. Its mighty isolated nearest neighbor is miles away. I chuckled. That's kind of the point. I could use some peace and quiet. Well, just be careful out there, especially at night. There's things in those woods, things that ain't entirely natural, if you know what I mean. There was a strange look in Hank's faded blue eyes, but I chalked it up to the superstitions of a man who'd likely spent his whole life in this remote corner of the country. I thanked him, tossed my supplies in the SUV, and headed out towards the cabin as the first stars began to peek out of the darkening sky. The dirt road leading to the property was narrow and winding, flanked by towering pines that seemed to press in from all sides. By the time I reached the cabin, full night had fallen, and I had to use my headlights to navigate the final stretch of overgrown driveway. The cabin itself was small and rustic, made of weathered logs, featuring a simple porch that faced out into the dense forest. Inside, it was sparsely furnished but cozy, with a fireplace, a well-worn sofa, and a small kitchen area. A mirror ladder led up to an open loft bedroom. Too tired from the long drive to unpack, I simply grabbed my sleeping bag and climbed up into the loft, collapsing onto the creaky wooden floor. As I drifted off to sleep, I remembered thinking how utterly still and silent it was out here, so different from the constant background noise of the city. The only sound was the low hooting of an owl somewhere out in the inky blackness beyond the thin cabin walls. Little did I know that the tranquility of that first night would soon be shattered and my peaceful getaway would spiral into a nightmare. I could never have imagined, because deep in the ancient forest that surrounded me, something was stirring, something that would soon reveal itself and change the course of my life forever. I woke late the next morning to golden sunlight filtering in through the dusty loft window. For a moment, I simply lay there in my sleeping bag, savoring the incredible quiet, breathing in the piney scent of the forest that permeated the cabin. After our simple breakfast of granola and instant coffee, I set about exploring my surroundings. The cabin was set in a small clearing, with dense woods pressing close on all sides. A fire pit and a dilapidated shed were the only other structures on the property. I spent the day hiking the faint trails that wound through the trees, marveling at the beauty of the autumn foliage, the maples ablaze in vivid crimson and golds, the birches shimmering pale yellow. The forest seemed to go on forever, a vast primeval wilderness that swallowed me up in its depths. As dusk began to creep in, I built a small campfire near the cabin and heated up a can of soup for dinner. Basking in the warm glow of the flames, breathing the fragrant wood smoke, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I had needed, a chance to unplug from the hectic modern world and reconnect with nature. As fall darkness fell and the night pressed close around the dwindling circle of firelight, Hank's ominous words from the day before drifted back to me unbidden. There's things in those woods, things that ain't entirely natural. A shiver ran down my spine and I chuckled uneasily to myself, feeling foolish for letting the old man's superstitious ramblings get under my skin. Suddenly, from somewhere out in the blackness of the trees came a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, high, mournful howl that shattered the silence of the night. It sounded close, maybe only 100 yards or so from where I sat by the dying fire, and yet there was something about it that wasn't quite right. It was deeper, more guttural than any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. A howl rose in pitch, taking on an almost human quality before trailing off into the dark, heart pounding. I leapt up and quickly doused the remnants of the fire, plunging the clearing into darkness. I hurried into the cabin, locking the door securely behind me as though that flimsy bolt could hold back the unknown terrors of the forest night. In the loft, I huddled in my sleeping bag with my flashlight clutched tightly to my chest, straining to hear any further sign of the thing that had made that chilling sound. But the words had fallen silent again, offering no clue as to what lurked in their shadows. Sleep was a long time coming that night, and when it finally did claim me, my rest was troubled with strange, unsettling dreams. Visions of something huge and dark loping through the trees on two legs, its eyes glinting red in the moonlight. the wind carrying the stench of damp fur and fetid breath and old blood. I jerked awake shortly after dawn, unsure if it was the pale light slanting into the loft or the lingering unease from my nightmares that had roused me. Fragments of the dreams came back to me, hazy but still deeply disturbing. That howl in the night no longer seemed quite so easily dismissed in the light of day. I tried to shake off the irrational fear as I went about my morning routine, telling myself that it had surely just been a coyote or some other normal forest creature. But as I forced down a protein bar and some water for breakfast, my appetite strangely absent, I couldn't fully convince myself. Determined to clear my head, I set out on another hike, following one of the trails deeper into the woods than I had the previous day. But the soothing tranquility I had found before seemed to have deserted the forest. The sunlight filtering down through the fiery canopies seemed wan and watery, the birdsong oddly muted and sporadic. And all around me the trees almost seemed to be watching, the gnarled trunks and reaching branches suddenly taking on a more ominous aspect. About an hour into my hike, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, in a small clearing just off the path, was the torn and bloody carcass of a deer. It looked quite fresh, only partially eaten, but it was the manner of predation that made my skin crawl. The kill was far too large and too vicious to be the work of any coyote or bobcat. Half the deer's ribcage was simply gone, wrenched away as if by incredible strength. Viscera strewed across the blood-soaked earth, and they're pressed deep into the soil. Around the grisly remains was a scattering of immense three-toed footprints, far too big to be from any animal I recognized. A creeping dread began to wind its tendrils around my hammering heart as I recalled stories I'd read online in the past, the ones I'd always laughed off as mere folklore and legend. Stories of a hulking, dog-like creature that stalked the deep woods. Not quite wolf and not quite man, they called it half beast, half something else. It's a relic of a primordial world that existed in the shadows just beyond the firelight of civilization. I turned and hurried back towards the cabin, no longer able to deny the icy fear that gripped me. I was no longer alone in these woods, and whatever shared this wilderness with me was like nothing I had ever known. As I burst back into the clearing where the cabin stood, I froze. The door of the shed stood ajar, sagging on rusted hinges, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had not left it that way. Heart in my throat, I crept closer, peering into the dark recesses within. A shape lay crumpled against the back wall, partially hidden under a moldering tarp. Hand shaking, I pulled aside the rotted fabric to reveal the desiccated remains of a human body. Little more than a skeleton, clad in the tattered remnants of clothing. Tatters of leathery skin clung to the bones, and the skull grinned up at me, with empty socket scraps of hair still clinging to it. It looked like it had been there for years, choking back a scream. I stumbled away from the grisly discovery, my mind reeling. What was happening here? What nightmare had I unwittingly wandered into? The forest that had seemed so tranquil and idyllic just a day before now felt dark and alien, filled with ancient secrets and unimaginable horrors. And somewhere out there in the lengthening shadows of the afternoon, I could feel it watching me, the beast that old-timers whispered about around campfires, the unnatural thing that roamed the deep woods, the dogman. And I knew that once full night fell, it would come for me. I had to get out of here. I had to find my way back to civilization before darkness swallowed the forest once more. But as I turned towards where I had parked my SUV, my heart seized in my chest. The vehicle sat awkwardly on the edge of the clearing, two tires shredded, deep claw marks scoring the metal doors. I was trapped, alone and defenseless, stalked by a nightmare made flesh. And the only question that remained was whether it would toy with me, draw out my terror, or simply rip me apart, as it had the deer in the forest, leaving my bones to molder alongside the forgotten remains in the shed. As the sun began its inexorable descent toward the horizon, staining the sky the color of blood, I knew I would soon have my answer. With my SUV disabled and darkness swiftly approaching, I knew my only chance was to fortify the cabin and pray that it would be enough to keep the creature at bay until night. My hands shook as I dragged the heavy wooden table and chairs from the kitchen, piling them against the front door as a barricade. I wedged the cabin's few rusted tools, an axe, a shovel, a crowbar into the gaps, jamming the door as securely as I could manage. In the shed, beneath the grim sentinel of the desiccated corpse, I found a few dusty cans of kerosene. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding, and began soaking rags in the pungent fluid, stuffing them into the cracks around the windows and doors. The fumes made my head swim, but I didn't dare risk even the smallest gap that might allow the beast entry. As the last of the daylight bled from the sky, I retreated to the loft with my flashlight and the old axe, the most substantial weapon I had been able to find. From my elevated vantage point, I could see out the small window that overlooked the clearing and the dark wall of trees beyond. For a long time there was nothing, only the night sounds of the forest, the breeze sighing through the branches and the distant hoot of an owl. But then, as the moon rose over the treetops, casting the world in an eerie silver glow, I heard it. It started low, a deep, guttural rumbling that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my feet. Then it rose into that same mournful howl I had heard the night before, echoing through the woods and growing closer with every passing second. And beneath the howl I could hear the sound of something huge crashing through the underbrush, snapping twigs and branches, bearing down on the cabin with terrible intent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped the axe with white knuckles, my wide eyes fixed on the window. Then I saw it. It burst from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, a monstrous silhouette backlit by the moon, far larger than any wild animal had a right to be. As it loped towards the cabin on powerful, strangely articulated legs, I could make out more details: the shaggy fur, the twisted amalgamation of wolf and human features, the eyes that glowed red in the darkness. It was the dogman, the beast of legend, and it was here at my door. It hit the cabin like a battering ram, the log walls shuddering with the impact. I heard the groaning of the lumber, the splintering of wood as the creature hurled itself against my flimsy barricades with relentless fury. The kerosene-soaked drags seemed to deter it not at all. If anything, they merely seemed to enrage it further. Again and again it slammed against the walls, the door, the shuttered windows. The cabin shook, dust sifting down from the rafters, the roof timbers creaking ominously. I knew it was only a matter of time before the beast found a weak point, before the old wood gave way beneath its terrible strength. And then, with a shattering crash and a roar of bestial triumph, it was inside. I heard it ripping through my barricades like they were made of matchsticks. I heard its heavy tread on the floorboards below. The reek of it flooded the cabin, the stench of wild animal musk and rotting meat. It snuffled and growled as it searched for me. The sound filled with hunger, fury, and a terrible alien intelligence. In the loft, I pressed myself back into the corner, the axe clutched to my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I knew I had only seconds before it found the ladder, before it was upon me. And then I saw the eyes glowing red in the darkness at the edge of the loft. I heard the scrape of claws on wood as it began to climb. The beast's head rose into view, its lips peeled back from jagged yellow fangs, strings of drool swinging from its maw. It fixed me with a predator's stare, filled with a horrifying mixture of animal bloodlust and something disturbingly close to human hatred. I braced myself as the creature hauled its huge body into the loft, knowing that I had mere moments left, that my life would soon be over in a welter of blood and agony. But I was determined to go down, fighting to sink the axe into the thing's skull, even as it ripped me apart. I would not let the beast take me easily. With a roar that shook the rafters, it lunged. Time seemed to slow as the beast hurled itself towards me, its massive jaws gaping wide, its claws reaching for my flesh. In that crystallized moment of terror, I swung the axe with every ounce of strength in my body, a desperate cry tearing itself from my throat. The heavy blade sank into the side of the creature's neck with a sickening thunk, biting deep into the corded muscle. The dogman let out a high, awful shriek of pain and rage, its hot blood splattering my face and chest. But the blow was not enough to stop its charge, and it slammed into me like a freight train. We crashed to the floor of the loft in a tangle of thrashing limbs and snapping teeth, the axe handle slipping from my grip. I felt its claws rake my shoulder, white-hot lines of agony, smelled its carry-on breath as it lunged for my throat. Desperately, I seized handfuls of its shaggy fur, straining with all my might to hold back those terrible jaws. We rolled across the floor, smashing into the walls, knocking over the meager furniture. The beast was immensely strong, its muscles coiled with a supernatural power, but the wound I had dealt it was taking its toll. I could feel the hot gush of its blood soaking into my clothes as we grappled. Could hear its breathing growing more labored and ragged. With a burst of desperate strength, I managed to get my feet up under the thing's belly and kicked out with all my might. The dogman flew backwards, smashing through the flimsy railing of the loft and tumbling out of sight to the floor below with a heavy thud. Gasping for breath, I staggered to my feet, snatching up the fallen axe. Below, I could hear the beast thrashing and snarling, but it sounded weaker, its movements more sluggish. I knew I had hit it badly, perhaps even mortally. I descended the ladder cautiously, axe at the ready, dreading what I might find. The dogman lay in a spreading pool of its own blood, a long gash in its neck pumping out the last of its life in crimson spurts. But still it tried to rise, its baleful red eyes fixing on me, its jaws snapping weakly. Almost without thought, I brought the axe down on the thing's skull again and again until it moved no more, until the light faded from those hellish eyes and it lay still at last. Only then, standing over the twisted remains of the nightmare-made flesh, did I allow myself to believe that it was over, that I had somehow survived. But even as I stumbled out into the pre-dawn light, leaving the blood-soaked cabin and the corpse of the beast behind, I knew that I would never be the same. I had stared into the abyss, into the primal heart of darkness that beat beneath the veneer of the civilized world, and it had forever marked me. The authorities never quite believed my story when they found me staggering down the forest road miles from the cabin, caked in blood. Both mine and not the official report spoke of animal attacks, of delusions brought on by stress and isolation, but I knew the truth. I knew that there were ancient things that lurked in the shadows beyond the firelight, horrors that defied explanation. I had faced the dogman and lived, but a part of me would always remain in those woods, forever looking over my shoulder, forever listening for that eerie howl on the night wind. For once you've gazed into the eyes of the beast, you can never truly go back to the world you knew before. The primal wildness that lives in the depths of the forest. It lives in the depths of the human soul as well, and it can never be forgotten or denied, only endured. And so I endure day by day, with the memory of that night forever seared into my mind, the scars on my body a testament to the reality of the impossible, for I have stood at the edge of the abyss and faced the nightmare with it. I have met the dogman, and I have survived. In the years since that fateful night in the cabin, I have tried to piece together the fragments of the truth, to understand the nature of the thing I faced and the grim history of that lonely stretch of woods. The remains in the cabin shed, I learned, were those of the previous owner, a man named Jeremiah Hawkins, who had disappeared over a decade ago. His family had a long history in the area, stretching back generations, and the locals spoke of them only in hushed whispers. They were stories of strange rites practiced deep in the forest, of blood sacrifices and pacts with dark powers, of a clan tainted by evil, and always woven through these whispered tales were the stories of the beast, the dogman that stalked the woods, the cursed guardian of the Hawkins' dark legacy. Some claimed it was a demon summoned by the family's black magic, others a human transformed by ancient Native American curses, but all agreed that it was unnatural, a thing that should not be, a horror that had haunted the deep woods for untold years. I pored over old newspaper articles, faded historical documents, obscure folklore collections, trying to untangle the web of secrets and lies. But the truth remained elusive, shrouded in mystery and superstition. All I knew for certain was that the thing I had killed was real, and that the dark history of the Hawkins clan was somehow intertwined with its existence. But though the beast was dead, I could not shake the feeling that something of it lingered, that the ancient evil that had birthed it still held sway in those shattered woods. The scar it had left on my body and on my soul throbbed like a warning, a reminder that there are some mysteries better left buried, some doors that should never be opened. And yet I find myself drawn back to those woods year after year, unable to resist their dark siren call. I wander the overgrown trails past the crumbling ruins of the old Hawkins homestead, my heart quickening at every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flits between the trees. For I know now that the dogman was only a symptom of a deeper malignancy, a rot that festers in the very heart of the forest. And I know that in some strange way my destiny is tied to this place, that I will never be truly free until I unravel its darkest secrets, or until they drag me down into the depths forever. And so I continue my lonely vigil, the keeper of a grim knowledge, the guardian of a truth too terrible to speak aloud. For I am seeing beyond the veil of the world we think we know, glimpse the nightmares that lurk in the dim corners of reality. And I know that, in the end, all our vaunted science and reason are but fragile candles flickering in the endless night that surrounds us. For in the deepest shadows of the forest, in the darkest reaches of the human heart, the old gods still hold sway. The ancient beasts still howl, and woe to those who dare to tread in their domain unprepared, who seek to plumb the mysteries that should be left alone. I am forever changed, forever haunted by the knowledge of that other world that exists beside our own. But I will keep watch, will stand sentinel at the edge of the abyss, for I know now what price must be paid for the blissful ignorance of civilization, and I know that I will never be able to pay it. The dogman is dead, but the darkness it served lives on, and I will forever dwell in its shadow, a grim reminder of the truth we so desperately seek to deny. For I have met the beast, and I will carry its mark until the day I die. My name is Liam Novak. I'm a park ranger in the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota. I took this job to get away from my problems back home in Minneapolis. I was drowning in debt, my girlfriend left me, and I was drinking too much. I needed a fresh start. Being a ranger suited me. I've always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, fishing, and I liked the solitude. Most days I didn't see another human soul. Just miles of dense forest in every direction. It was a hard job though, long hours, tough conditions. In the winter the temperature could drop to 40 below, and in the summer the mosquitoes were relentless. But I didn't mind. Out here my problems seemed small. I felt free. There were occasional dangers too, of course. Black bears, moose, the odd mountain lion. Nothing I couldn't handle with some common sense and my trusty bear spray. Or at least that's what I thought until that fateful summer when I crossed paths with something I still can't explain. Something that haunts me to this day. They call it the dogman, a creature that walks upright like a man but is covered in dark fur like a wolf. It has the snout of a dog and the glowing eyes of a demon. People claim to have seen it stalking the woods at night. We used to dismiss it as folklore, just a scary story to tell around the campfire. I did too, but that was before I looked into its eyes myself. It started with campers reporting strange sounds coming from the woods at night. Howling that sounded almost human, snarls and growls that made your hair stand on end. At first I chalked it up to coyotes or maybe a pack of wolves passing through, but something felt off. The sightings came next. A hiker claimed he saw a large dog-like creature walking on two legs. Another swore the thing came sniffing around her tent in the night, leaving strange tracks in the mud. I tried to reassure them it was just a bear, but I wasn't so sure myself. The reports kept coming in, then the attack started. First it was just deer torn apart and half-eaten. Park rangers in the next county found a mutilated moose carcass. They said it looked like it had been ripped to shreds by powerful claws and teeth like no animal they'd ever seen deep down. I knew something was very wrong. This was more than just a bear or wolf, but I had no idea how bad it was about to get, or that the nightmare was soon going to show up at my door. Late one evening I was in my cabin, filling out some paperwork when a frantic knocking made me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door to find a woman standing there sobbing and shaking. "Help me," she begged. It took my husband. Her name was Sarah. She and her husband Tom had been camping near Otter Creek when something attacked their campsite. She described a huge, snarling creature covered in black fur. She said it grabbed Tom and dragged him off into the woods. I tried to calm her down, promising we'd organize a search party at first light, but she was hysterical, insisting we had to go now or there wouldn't be anything left to find. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We took my Jeep as far as we could, then set out on foot, shining our lights into the dense underbrush. An hour later, I spotted something on the trail ahead. Pieces of torn, bloody clothing, a boot, and a scrap of flesh. But no sign of Tom. I was about to turn to Sarah to convince her that we needed to head back when I heard a guttural growl that froze my blood. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and there, at the edge of the light, two glowing red eyes stared back at me. I've never been so terrified in my life. Those red eyes burned into mine with a predatory, almost human intelligence. I fumbled for my bear spray with shaking hands as a dark shape detached from the shadows and moved toward us. It was like a wolf walking on its hind legs, but larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. "Run, Sarah," I yelled, but she seemed frozen in place, fixated on the advancing creature, tears streaming down her face. "Tom," she whispered. I grabbed her arm and yanked her away. Just as the thing lunged, I felt hot breath and snapping jaws brush my neck as we crashed through the forest in blind panic. Branches whipped at my face as my heart hammered in my ears. At some point I realized I'd lost Sarah. I paused, gasping, straining to hear over the sound of my own ragged breathing, but the woods were silent. The creature was gone, and so was Sarah. Shaken, I stumbled my way back to the Jeep and spent a sleepless night wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I couldn't get those red eyes out of my head. I knew one thing for certain now. The dog man wasn't just a myth, it was real, and it was out there somewhere. I tried to tell myself I'd done everything I could, that more people would have died if we kept blundering around in the dark, but the guilt still gnawed at me. I hadn't been able to save Tom. I left Sarah behind. Some protector I was. As the sun rose, I met with the other rangers and the police to coordinate a search party, but I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I knew they'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was. I barely slept in days and my nerves were shot, but I had to find them. Tom, Sarah, and some kind of answers. For 3 days we combed those woods. We found the scattered remains of Tom's shredded corpse, but no sign of Sarah or the thing I'd seen. Had she escaped? Had it taken her like it took her husband? I didn't know. The official report said Tom had been killed by a bear. The press even picked it up. Grizzly bear attack in Minnesota woods. Well, I knew the truth, and I knew I couldn't rest until I faced it again. Even if it killed me, I had to try. It's been months now since that night. The trail has gone cold and the case was closed. Everyone else has moved on. I can't. I won't. I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. Part of me wonders if Sarah is still alive, if she's now a prisoner of that thing in the woods, or worse, if she's become one of them. They say sometimes when a human is bitten by a werewolf, they turn into one themselves. Every night I sit on my porch with my gun in my lap, watching the tree line and listening. I'd become a ghost, a shell of my former self. I've lost weight, grown a wild beard. People avoid me now, whispering that I've gone crazy, and maybe they're right. Maybe I have, but I made a promise that I'd be the guardian of these woods, that I protect the innocent from the monsters that lurk in the dark, and it's a promise I intend to keep, even if it costs me everything. I am the guardian. I am the watcher in the woods, and I'm coming for you, Dogman. I wanted to get away. Between the bills piling up, the long hours on a dead-end job, and a messy breakup, I was barely keeping it together in my cramped Detroit apartment. My buddy Steve had a remote cabin deep in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula that he said I could use any time. I'd never been much of an outdoorsman, but the idea of leaving everything behind for a while was too appealing to pass up. I threw some clothes, camping gear, and a week's worth of food into my beat-up Corolla and hit the road. My financial and relationship worries receding in the rearview mirror with each passing mile. As I drove, the busy interstate gave way to quiet state highways lined with towering pine trees. After 4 hours of driving, I turned onto a rutted dirt track that Steve had assured me would take me straight to the cabin. Dense forest pressed in on both sides. As the car bounced and jostled over the uneven road, I felt a rising sense of unease as the canopy grew thicker overhead, blocking out the late afternoon sun. Had I made a wrong turn somewhere? Just as I was considering turning back, the trees opened up into a small clearing dominated by a rustic log cabin. I breathed a sigh of relief. This was the place. The cabin was small and primitive, with no electricity or running water, but after the chaos of the city, it felt like a sanctuary. I unloaded my supplies and set about making a fire to ward off the October chill. As night fell, I sat by the crackling flames, savoring the stillness of the forest. Maybe this trip was just what I needed to clear my head and figure out my next steps. I banked the fire and retreated into the cabin, settling into the musty cot with a worn paperback. Slug came quickly, but my dreams were troubled. I was running through an endless forest, pursued by something I couldn't quite see. I walked with a start, my heart pounding, unsure where I was. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the familiar contours of the cabin came into focus. Just a nightmare. I rolled over and wheeled myself back to sleep. Sometime later, a sound jolted me awake, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. It sounded close, and unlike anything I had ever heard before. As I lay there in the darkness, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart, one thought crystallized in my mind. Whatever had made that sound, it was no ordinary wolf mourning, brought a bit of respite from the paranoia of the previous night. As I sat on the cabin's narrow porch, sipping instant coffee, the forest felt peaceful. Even welcoming birds flitted between the golden-leaved maples, and the light filtering through the canopy had an almost ethereal quality. I chided myself for letting a nightmare and some distant animal get under my skin. After breakfast, I set out to explore the surrounding area. Steve had mentioned an old stone quarry a half-mile from the cabin that offered some decent fishing. I packed a lunch, grabbed my rod, and set off into the woods following his sketched map. The day had turned warm, and before long I had stripped down to a t-shirt, enjoying the feel of the sun on my shoulders. I reached the quarry by midday. The quiet, almost circular lake ringed by sheer stone walls. The water was strikingly clear and looked promising for fishing. I set up on a flat boulder by the shoreline, baited my hook, and cast into the glossy surface, watching the rings expand until I lapped at the edges of the quarry. So sucked away as I absorbed myself in the simple rhythm of casting and reeling. The sun crept towards the western horizon and the air began to cool. I just decided to pack it in when I got a strong tug on the line. The rod bent nearly double as I struggled to reel in my catch. Finally, a large trap broke the surface, thrashing against the line. I pulled it ashore, feeling a sense of triumph. As I gathered up my gear, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. That strange feeling of being watched was back. I scanned the trade line, seeing nothing but lengthening shadows. I shook it off and began to walk back towards the path. A twig snapped somewhere in the woods behind me, much too loud to be from anything small. I quickened my pace. Another snap, closer this time. My brisk walk became a panicked run. I arrived at the cabin breathless and shaking, slamming the solid door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to slow my breathing. It had just been my imagination, right? I built up the fire and attempted to distract myself by cooking the trout, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. As night blanketed the forest once again, the howls began. They sounded different than before, almost mournful, and much closer than the previous night. I huddled by the dying embers until dawn, too terrified to sleep. Exhausted and edgy from a sleepless night, I decided over breakfast that I needed to cut the trip short. I felt silly. It had probably just been a coyote or a feral dog that I had heard. But the isolation of the cabin had begun to feel more menacing than peaceful. I would much rather be back in my rundown apartment than jumping at every nighttime sound in the forest. I spent the morning packing up my belongings in a fog of fatigue and nagging paranoia aside. Part of me regretted leaving this tranquil place so soon. Maybe after a couple good nights' sleep back in civilization, I would feel differently. I could always come back and give it another shot. I did a final sweep of the cabin's interior, checking for forgotten items. As I stepped onto the porch, a flash of white at the tree line caught my eye. I turned to look and felt my knees nearly buckle from shock. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood an enormous wolf-like creature, easily the size of a black bear, but it wasn't the size that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The creature stood upright on two legs, its front limbs hanging down like grotesque arms ending in paw-like hands. Tattered fur hung from its emaciated frame. Milky eyes stared out from a protruding snout filled with jagged teeth. The creature swayed back and forth, making a horrible whining sound. With a flash of insight, I knew two things with absolute certainty. One, the creature had been stalking me since my arrival at the cabin. And two, it was unquestionably terrifyingly unnatural. Raw panic propelled me into motion. I leapt off the porch, hurling my bags into the car. The creature took a staggering step towards me, then another. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, finally managing to wrench open the door and throw myself inside. As I turned the ignition, I saw the creature loping towards the car in the rearview mirror with shocking speed, its eyes blazing with feral intensity. I stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The tires spun out and caught traction, sending the car lurching forward in seconds. I was fishtailing down the rutted track, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that abomination. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. 20 minutes later, my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it might beat out of my chest. Questions raced through my mind. Was that thing? Where had it come from? As the adrenaline began to ebb, I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up. I was acting like I'd seen a monster. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was a bear with mange or someone playing a sick prank. Either way, I had the sudden urge to put a couple 100 miles between myself and those woods. I nudged onto the southbound highway, setting my sights on home. But deep down, I knew I could never unsee what I had just witnessed. As the forest receded in my mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature, whatever it was, would haunt my nightmares for a long time to come. Look, man, I know what I saw. Steve sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. We were sitting at his kitchen table with a six-pack of beer between us. It had been 3 days since I got back to Detroit. 3 sleepless nights punctuated by vivid nightmares of the creature stalking me through darkened city streets. I'd finally broken down and called Steve, spilling my guts about what had happened at the cabin. I half expected him to laugh it off, tell me to lay off the whiskey before bed, but instead he just went quiet. "I'm not saying you didn't see something," he said finally, "but a werewolf. You have to admit it sounds crazy." I bristled at the word werewolf. Ridiculous movie monsters of the full moon, pentagrams, and silver bullets. What I had seen was more primal, more terrifyingly real. It wasn't a damn werewolf. I snapped and immediately regretted my tone. Steve was just trying to wrap his head around it. Hell, so was I. This was something different. Steve considered me for a long moment, then got up and left the kitchen. I heard him rummaging in the other room. He returned holding an old cigar box, which he set on the table between us. "My grandpa spent most of his life in the UK trapping and fishing," he said as he opened the box. "He used to tell me stories about the things he saw in the woods. Things that didn't quite add up." He pulled out a faded Polaroid and slid it across to me. The photo showed a shirtless man in waders standing by a river holding a string of salmon, but I barely registered him. My eyes were drawn instead to the background, to a blurred white shape half hidden among the trees. Even out of focus, the shape was horribly familiar. "Grandpa took that photo the summer of 1973, Steve said quietly, always claiming there was something unnatural in the woods that year. Animals gone missing, strange tracks. That wasn't the only photo he took." With cold fingers, I thumbed through the rest of the Polaroids. Each one showed a tall, pale figure lurking in the forest. They were quite in focus. In a few, the creature appeared to be looking directly at the camera with disturbing intensity. "We called it the Dog Man," Steve continued, saying the old-timers spoke of it in whispers, a creature that was neither man nor beast, stalking the deep woods. I looked up at him, a chill running down my spine. "Why didn't you tell me about this before I went up there?" Steve shook his head. "Honestly, I always thought they were just stories, something to tell around the campfire to give folks a scare. I never imagined." He trailed off, his eyes distant. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of realization heavy between us. Finally, I drained my beer and stood up. "I need to go back," I said. "I need to know for sure." Steve looked at me like I had just suggested a scenic cruise on the river Styx. "Are you insane? But if this thing is real, you want to go." Looking for it, I thought of the creature's dead eyes, the way its sinewy limbs had propelled it towards me, thought of the mind-bending wrongness of its very existence. He was right, it was insane. But so was spending my life, looking over my shoulder, jumping in every shadow. "I have to," I said simply. "I have to know I'm not crazy." Steve held my gaze for a long moment, then sighed. "Then I'm coming with you." I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off. "That's my family's cabin, and more importantly, you're my friend. I let you go up there alone once. I won't make that mistake again." I wanted to argue, but part of me was relieved. Relieved to not have to face this alone. Together, we began to plan our return to the woods, back to the den of the Dogman, back to the nightmare. We took Steve's truck, a battered old Ford that looked like it had seen its share of rough country. The drive was mostly silent, each of us absorbed in our own troubled thoughts. As we bumped down the dirt track towards the cabin, a sense of dread that had been steadily building in my gut crescendoed into a gnawing fear. Steve must have sensed it too. He cut the engine in the overgrown driveway and turned to look at me, his face grim, last chance to turn back. He said no shame in it. I met his eyes, saw my own unease mirrored there, but underneath it was a steely resolve. I shook my head. "I'm not running from this, not again." We climbed out into the gathering dusk, the slam of the truck's doors unnaturally loud in the forest stillness. The cabin looked just as I had left it, a squat silhouette against the darkening trees. But the sense of peace, of sanctuary, was gone now. It felt like bait in a trap, luring us into the dogman's lair. I shouldered my backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of the hunting knife inside. Steve had insisted we arm ourselves, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against the creature. He carried a high-powered hunting rifle, the kind used to take down grizzly bears. As we approached the cabin, a sound drifted through the trees that turned my blood to ice. It was a howl, long and mournful, but shot through with a distorted human quality that made my skin crawl. It sounded close. Steve and I exchanged a glance. No words were needed. We hurried into the cabin. Bolting the door behind us, Steve moved to the window, peering out into the gloom. I busied myself building a fire in the hearth, more for the light and comfort than for warmth. We settled in to wait, perched on the edges of the worn armchairs like sprinters. At the starting line, adrenaline jangled through my system, making my leg bounce and my palms sweat. Every creak of the old cabin's timbers, every rustle of the wind in the eaves made me flinch. An hour ticked by, then two. Steve paced restlessly, occasionally pausing to scan the tree line through the dingy windows. Each time he turned away in frustration. I was starting to wonder if we had made a mistake, if the creature was long gone. When Steve went suddenly rigid, he hissed by the tree line. I leapt to my feet, hurrying to his side. At first I saw nothing but shadowy trunks and underbrush. Then something shifted in the darkness. A pale form detaching itself from the deeper gloom. The breath caught in my throat. It was the creature, the dog man. It moved with a lurching, almost stumbling gait, but I knew how deceptive that was. I had seen firsthand the shocking speed it was capable of. As it neared the cabin, details leapt out in the flickering light, spilling from the windows, tattered fur clinging to emaciated ribs, overlong arms ending in wickedly curved claws. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes milky white and pupilless, they seemed to bore straight through me into the marrow of my soul. Beside me, Steve made a choking sound. I tore my gaze away from the creature to look at him. He was ashen, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in the unflappable man before. In that moment, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. We had come seeking answers, confirmation of the impossible. But now staring our nightmare made flesh in the face. I just wanted to be as far away from this cursed place as possible. The creature took another staggering step forward. It was no more than 30 feet from the cabin now, close enough that I could hear its labored, rattling breath. Close enough that I knew with bone-deep certainty that the flimsy walls and bolt lock were not going to keep it out. It threw back its head, uttering a hoarse cry that was somewhere between a howl and a scream. Yet so much more terrible than either. The sound raked across my mind like rusted nails, opening up chasms of gibbering terror. In that moment, pinned by the dogman's dead gaze, I knew I was looking into the abyss, into a darkness that existed long before man first dreamed of monsters. The creature tensed its sinewy muscles, coiling beneath the ragged fur. Time seemed to stretch and slow. I saw its haunches bunch, so I prepared to leap. In that crystallized moment of terror, some primal instinct took over. I dove to the side just as the creature crashed through the window in an explosion of glass and splintering wood. Jagged shards sliced across my cheek as I hit the ground and rolled, feeling the whoosh of displaced air as a clawed hand swiped through the space where my head had been a heartbeat before. Chaos erupted in the small cabin. The creature howled in frustration, thrashing among the wreckage of the window. I tried to scramble up to put distance between myself and those scythe-like claws, but my feet tangled in the remnants of the curtain. I fell hard on my side, the air escaping my lungs in a rush. The floor shook as the creature took 2 staggering steps towards me. I could smell it now, a rank odor of wet fur and carrion. It loomed over me, milky eyes ablaze with feral hunger. I scrabbled backwards, my hand groping for something, anything to defend myself, and found my fingers closed around the handle of the fire poker. I swung it with all my strength. I felt it connect with the creature's leg with a sickening crunch. The creature stumbled back, a shrill yelp escaping its throat, but seemed more enraged than hurt. It lunged forward, jaws snapping, forcing me to roll away. Then the cabin erupted with the deafening boom of a rifle. The creature jerked as if punched. Dark blood sprayed from its shoulder. I looked over to see Steve braced against the far wall, the rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. He chambered another round, his face lit with desperate courage. The creature whirled to face him, seeming to have forgotten me entirely. It stalked forward with a new note of menace in its rattling growl. Steve fired again, and the muzzle flash lit the room like lightning. The bullet struck the creature high in the chest, but it barely slowed. Steve yelled, "Get to the truck." His eyes never left the advancing monstrosity as he chambered another round. I hesitated for only an instant. Steve fired again, and in that moment, I saw my chance. I sprinted for the open door, a sob of relief and terror escaping me as I burst out into the cool night air. Behind me I heard a terrible wrenching scream and a clatter that could only be the rifle hitting the floor. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran then, my lungs burning and legs pounding, but I didn't stop until I reached the truck. With shaking hands, I threw myself inside and groped for the keys. As I turned the ignition, I cast one last look at the cabin. The door gaped open like a missing tooth, but nothing moved. Tears blurred the view within. As I slammed the truck into gear and roared off down the track, bitter self-recrimination warred with gut-wrenching horror as I sped through the night as far and as fast from that place as I could. I should have never left him, but the memory of those teeth, those claws, was enough to chase any thought of heroism from my mind. In that moment, I was reduced to the most primal of imperatives: survive. I raced on into the velvet dark, the cabin and its nightmare denizen dwindling behind me until it became just one more shadow in the dense woods. I knew that shadow would haunt me for the rest of my days, lurking in every darkened room and moonlit thicket. But I was alive. By some twist of fate or act of providence, I had escaped the dogman's grasp. And for now, that would have to be enough. The police found no trace of Steve. I led them back to the cabin, battling my story between bouts of hysterical tears. But apart from the shattered window, the scene was eerily mundane. No blood and no alien footprints. No evidence at all that anything out of the ordinary had occurred there. They didn't say as much, but I could read the skepticism in their eyes. To them, I was just another city slicker who got drunk and spooked in the unfamiliar woods, and now his friend was paying the price. The search efforts lasted for weeks, police and volunteers combing the dense forest for any sign of the missing man. But as the days marched on with no leads, the searchers dwindled until it was only me left, haunting the train line like a ghost, calling his name until my voice grew hoarse. The official theory is that Steve had a misadventure in the woods. They believe he lost his way in the dark and succumbed to exposure. A tragic but not uncommon occurrence in the remote wilderness of the Upper Peninsula. No one entertains the notion that he fell victim to something far darker than the night. Something that defies explanation. When the search has ended, I returned to Detroit, to the bustle and grime of the city, but a part of me never left those woods. It stays there still forever, peering into the darkness between the trees, straining for a glimpse of pale fur and milky eyes. The dogman took more than my friend that night. It took my certainty, my sense of a rational world. I still see it in my dreams, stalking through the moon-dappled forest of my subconscious. I wake in the night, heart pounding in the echoes of its howl ringing in my ears. They say time heals all wounds, but some run too deep. Covet something too fundamental. So I'll carry my scars both seen and unseen. I'll walk through my days with the weight of that knowledge pressing at the back of my mind. The knowledge that there are things that lurk at the edges, things our tidy explanations can't account for. Not all monsters are make-believe, but perhaps that's the price of survival, of having gazed into the void and coming back, however imperfectly, to walk in the daylight world once more. The experience changed me. There's no denying that. It made me warier, but also more appreciative of the simple securities we take for granted. The door that locks, the light that banishes the dark, a loved one's heartbeat in the night. I still drive by Steve's house. Sometimes I see his truck in the drive gathering rust. I think of our last night together, of the easy camaraderie between us, rendered precious by the horror that followed. I think of his crooked smile, his effortless bravery there. At the end, I should have died with him. It eats at me the brutal unfairness of it, that coin flip of fate. But I did. And now I owe it to him and to myself to do more than just survive. I owe it to Leaves to honor his memory by being the man he knew I could be. The kind of friend who doesn't run. So I'll keep putting one foot in front of the other. I'll count my blessings even as I scan the shadows. And on the dark nights when the wind keenly whispers through the eaves like a lost and lonely thing, whisper a prayer for his restless soul because he's out there still. They both are the hunter and the hunted, locked forever in an endless pursuit through a primordial wood. Just beyond the edges of the firelight, one man's eternal nightmare is glimpsed for a terrifying instant through a shattered window. A story to freeze the blood, spoken in hushed whispers as the campfire dies. A story of the dog man and the friend I left behind. I needed to get away. The stress of my failing business and souring relationship had become too much. Spending some time alone in the remote quiet of nature seemed like the only way to clear my head. I loaded up my old pickup truck with camping supplies and hit the highway, driving 6 hours north from my home in Indianapolis into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Dense forests of pine, fir, and aspen stretched for miles in every direction. The roads cut narrow swaths through the wilderness. My destination was a rustic cabin I had rented online, nestled on the shores of a small lake, deep in the Ottawa National Forest. No electricity, no cell service, no other humans for miles. It would be the perfect place to unplug and reflect, or so I thought. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, with golden rays slashing through the trees. The cabin was small and simple, a single room with a fireplace, a cot, a table, chairs, and an old propane stove. Out front was a little dock extending into the glossy, mirror-like surface of the lake. The air was crisp and pine-scented. Aside from the occasional distant bird call, it was utterly silent. After unloading my supplies and starting a fire in the hearth, I sat on the small porch and watched nightfall over the forest. Stars emerged in the inky sky more than I had ever seen before. The Milky Way cut a hazy swath directly overhead. From somewhere in the vast woods, a lone wolf howled a plaintive cry. Despite the tranquil beauty, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling in my guts. The forest that had seemed pleasantly quiet a moment ago now felt too quiet, oppressively silent. The blackness between the trees seemed to conceal invisible eyes watching my every move. I shook it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination and city-dweller paranoia about the woods at night. Weary from the long drive, I retired into the small cabin, barred the door, banked the fire, and climbed into the creaky cot. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard a strange sound echoing through the night. A cross between a human scream and a wolf's howl. A chill ran through me as I remembered the old legends I had read about creatures stalking the vast forest of the north. I awoke the next morning feeling groggy and unrested, as if I had barely slept. Gray light filtered through the small dusty windows of the cabin. I emerged onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, looked out at the lake, and froze. There, clearly visible in the muddy bank, was a line of large canine-like footprints leading to the water's edge before disappearing. They were far too big to be a regular wolf or coyote. The shape was strange too, almost humanoid. A chill ran through me as I recalled the eerie howl I had heard the night before. I tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps a hunter with a large dog had passed by for an early morning swim, but in my heart I knew something wasn't right. I quickly retreated back inside the cabin, double-checking the locks. As the day went on, I tried to distract myself from my growing unease. I hiked through the gorgeous autumn colors of the forest, careful not to stray too far from the cabin and the lakeshore. I saw no other signs of the mystery visitor from the night before, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. In the dense forest, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch and whirl around. My knobs were on a hair trigger. I kept thinking. I glimpsed a dark shape observing me from behind a tree trunk or boulder, only to look again and see nothing, just tricks of the dappled light through the leaves. By late afternoon, leaden clouds had blanketed the sky and a chill wind whipped across the lake. I built up the fire and huddled close to its warmth. As the light faded to dusk, I couldn't bring myself to step outside again. Irrational as it was, I felt safe within the four walls of the cabin, like they could protect me from whatever lurked in the forest. Night felt like a physical weight pressing in against the small windows. Beyond the glow of my single kerosene lamp, the world was utterly black, no moon or stars tonight. Then I heard it, that same spine-chilling howl from the night before, but it sounded closer now. Just beyond the edge of the small clearing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back to civilization. I was miles from anything, trapped alone in a tiny cabin surrounded by an ocean of dark wilderness. So I just sat in terrified silence, gripping my hunting knife with white knuckles and staring unblinking at the door until gray dawn finally broke. After a sleepless night of constant vigilance and heart-pounding adrenaline, I awoke in the morning ragged and twitchy. The pale light did little to allay my fears. If anything, the events of the last 2 nights in this hauntingly remote place had pushed me to the breaking point. I couldn't take the isolation and paranoia anymore. I hastily threw my few belongings into my backpack, my hands trembling with exhaustion and nerves. All I could think about was getting back to my truck and putting these godforsaken woods in my rearview mirror. But as I shouldered open the heavy wooden door of the cabin, I stopped short. My veins turned to ice and a scream caught in my throat. There, gouged into the dirt all around the small clearing, was a fresh set of those massive canine tracks, at least a dozen circling the perimeter of the cabin. Whatever had made them had been here, just feet away as I cowered inside, stalking me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped cautiously off the porch, following the trail of disturbed earth and snapped underbrush it had left behind. The tracks led from the lakeshore straight to the door and then around to the back of the cabin. Steeling myself, I crept around the corner. The rear wall of the cabin was a scene of destruction. Rough-hewn logs had been smashed and engaged by powerful claws, some splintered and broken through, as if by massive jaws. The shutters were hanging from their hinges where they had been frantically torn at, like the creature had been trying to get inside to get to me. I felt my sanity fraying at the sight, my mind struggling to process what could have done this. Fighting down hysteria, I spun and sprinted for the trail where I had left my pickup. It crashed heedlessly through the woods. The trees seemed to be closing in around me, the shadows concealing my nightmares made real. It was only a quarter-mile to the trailhead, but it felt like an eternity. My lungs and legs burned as I ran like I had never run before. But even worse was the feeling of being pursued, of hearing heavy footfalls and panting breath behind me, gaining on me. I imagined slobbering jaws and blood-red eyes just at my back. I ruled myself not to look, knowing that if I did, I would die of sheer terror. After an eternity, I burst from the trees onto the gravel road ahead. I could see my old pickup waiting, a blessed sight. I felt a surge of hope. I was going to make it. But that hope shattered into horror a second later, because there, standing upright in the bed of the truck, silhouetted against the gray sky, was an unmistakable figure over 8 feet tall with the powerful body of a man but the head of a wolf. Its dagger-like teeth glinted as it opened its jaws and let out a blood-curdling howl. The creature fixed me with a murderous glare, its eyes full of feral hunger. I froze. All thoughts of reaching the salvation of the truck vanished. We stared at each other across the empty road. The hairs on my neck stood up as I realized it was savoring this moment before striking. It had clearly been stalking me, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. And now it had me exactly where it wanted. The stare down could have lasted more than a few seconds, but felt like an eternity, the predator and its helpless prey. Then, in a terrifying blur of teeth and claws, it lunged for me. Pure adrenaline and survival instinct hurled me into motion. I dove sideways off the road, feeling the wind from its body as it soared past, barely missing me. I scrambled for the only cover. I could see the woods behind me. I heard the creature crash to the ground. Momentum carried it far. It snarled with rage as it whipped around. I didn't wait for it to recover. I fled blindly into the trees, hurtling fallen logs and brush, scratching skin and clothing as I tore through the branches. My only thought was to disappear, to put any distance between myself and that monster. There was no plan, no rational thought, just abject terror. I had seen the size and power of the creature's body. I knew in any straight chase it would run me down in a heartbeat. My only hope was to lose it in the dense woods, to confuse it and evade capture until I could find safety. I ducked and jinked in random directions, trying desperately to obscure my trail, but each time I risked a glance behind me, I could still hear its thundering pursuit, see flashes of its huge figure between the trees. It was relentless. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and my heart hammered impossibly fast. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. Then miraculously, I broke through the tree line and found myself at the rocky shore of the lake. There, to my amazement, was a small aluminum rowboat pulled up on the rocks, its oars resting inside. I recognized it from the cabin's description. The owner kept it for guests. I risked a look back. The creature was still crashing through the forest behind me, but hadn't emerged yet. Sending a silent prayer of thanks to whoever had decided to provide this unlikely escape vessel, I splashed out into the frigid shallows and dragged the boat out until I could climb in and row. I pulled at the oars with every last drop of my fading strength, propelling the tiny craft out into the center of the lake. Just as the creature exploded from the underbrush onto the shore, its enraged howl echoed across the water, but its bulk made it back off from the crumbling rocks at the water's edge. For the moment at least, the lake was a barrier it could not cross. I was safe but stranded. I let the oars fall from my numb hands and collapsed in exhaustion. Overhead, the leaden sky opened up at last, and cold autumn rain began to fall. I drifted on that dark lake for what felt like hours at the mercy of the wind and current. The rain came down in relentless sheets and the small boat tossed in the choppy waves. I huddled on the floor, my soaked clothes plastered to my skin, shaking violently from cold and spent adrenaline. The fog of exhaustion and hypothermia made everything feel distant and dreamlike. At times I wasn't sure if I had really escaped or if I was still running ragged through that endless forest, the creature's breath hot on my heels. But the icy pitch and yaw of the boat and the sting of the rain were all too real. I felt helpless, totally adrift and fleeing that nightmare. On the shore, I had cut myself off from any hope of reaching my truck and the road back to safety and sanity. Now I had nothing but this tiny shell of aluminum between me and the primordial dangers of the water and woods. Questions churned sluggishly through my stunned mind. What was that creature? Some twisted genetic freak or prehistoric remnant? Or I shuddered to consider something supernatural. I never believed in such things, in ghosts and goblins and the old tales and whispered myths. But what I had just seen defied any natural explanation. The only clear thought I clung to was that I had to survive this. I I had to find a way off this lake and out of these godforsaken woods. I owed it to my family, to the people I loved, to myself to live and tell this tale, even if no one believed me. An interminable time later, through the gray veil of rain and mist, I started to make out the smudged shapes of trees and rocks. The wind must have pushed me across the lake. I was nearing the far shore. As I drew closer, I spotted a flash of color through the dreary woods, the red walls of some kind of structure. A sudden surge of hope and relief spurred me into action. I grabbed the oars and rowed with renewed purpose, fighting the wind and current to reach that distant beacon. Soon I could make it out more clearly. It was a small cabin, not unlike the one I had fled, rough-hewn and rustic, with a stack of firewood out front and a thin plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. As I watched, the front door banged open and a figure rushed out into the rain, waving its arms overhead. A person, another human soul in this vast wilderness. I threw my back into the oars and closed the final distance. As the skiff grounded into the sharp rocks of the shore, I merely sobbed with relief. The figure splashed out into the shallows and grabbed the gunwales, dragging the boat up onto the bank with strong arms. I looked up into the weathered, grizzled features of an old man. He had a wild beard and hard eyes that had clearly seen much, but they crinkled with concern as he reached down to me. "You're safe now, son. Let's get you inside." I sat in a daze as the old man helped me into his cabin and wrapped me in blankets by the roaring hearth. As warmth seeped back into my shocked limbs, my spinning mind started to settle. The man pressed a tin mug of strong black coffee into my hands and pulled up a chair across from me. He watched me closely, not saying anything, just waiting. I took a shuddering breath, the events of the last few days pouring out of me in a torrent, my voice cracking with emotion and urgency. Through it all, he just listened, his grizzled face grave, shaking his head slowly. When I finally ran out of words, he sighed deeply. "You're lucky," he rasped. "Damn lucky. Sounds like you met the dog man." I just looked at him. "The what? Dog man?" Michigan's own homegrown monstrosity. Folks had been telling stories about it for hundreds of years. Some kind of twisted, unnatural offspring of man and beast stalks these woods. Always seen near water, and it's got a taste for human flesh. An involuntary shiver ran through me. It was all true. The old legends, the wild tales, they were real. What is it? Where did it come from? The old man shrugged. No one rightly knows. Some say it's an ancient spirit of the land here before the tribes. Others reckon it's the spawn of dark magic from the old world, brought over by some depraved cult. It's an abomination, whatever it is. I looked down into my mug, watching the inky surface catch the flickering firelight. My voice was hollow. "So what can we do? How do we kill it?" The humorless bark of a laugh. "Kill it, son, you don't. Greater men than us have tried for generations, all lost to its foul hunger. Silver fire, modern guns. It doesn't make no difference, the dogman can't be killed." He stood abruptly and started rummaging through a cabinet, pulling out backpacks and gear. "Nah, there's only one thing to do. Only thing you can do against something like that." The old man looked back at me, and the firelight caught his eyes. There was something feral there, something haunted. His voice dropped low and deadly serious. "Run, run, and don't ever look back." I took his advice. We fled those woods, abandoning all our things. He led me through the wilderness for 3 days until we reached a ranger station where I could call for help. I never went back. The police investigated, even sent a search party to the lake, but they found nothing conclusive. Most of them didn't believe me or didn't want to. But I know the truth. I still see those red eyes in my nightmares. Still hear that unspeakable howl on the midnight wind. And I'll never stop running, because in the dark places, the wild places, the old places, there are things we were never meant to see. Things we can never escape, things we can only run from. My life was a mess, debts piling up, job stress through the roof, a girlfriend who just walked out. I needed to get away from it all. Living in the bustling city of Chicago, I'd always dreamed of escaping to the tranquil forests of northern Wisconsin. So when my uncle mentioned I could use his remote cabin in the woods for a week, I jumped at the chance. I threw my camping gear, some clothes and basic supplies in the car, and made the 6-hour drive up to Nicolet National Forest. The cabin was deep in the wilderness, miles from civilization. A perfect place to clear my head. My uncle warned me that the woods could play tricks on you, especially at night. Local legends spoke of strange creatures roaming the forest, but I chalked that up to backwoods superstition. I arrived in the late afternoon, the cabin appearing out of the dense pines. It was a rustic little place, but had everything I needed. 4 solid walls, a roof, a fireplace, basic furnishings. No phone, internet, or TV. But that's what I wanted, total isolation. That first evening I got a fire going, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch watching the sun set over the treetops. The forest slowly went from gold to crimson to purple. A light breeze whispered through the leaves. I breathed in the earthy smell of soil and pine. Maybe life wasn't so bad after all. But as night enveloped the woods, the atmosphere shifted. An unnatural stillness filled the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The darkness pressed in from all sides. Every crank of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. Ridiculous, I told myself, just my city's slicker nerves getting the better of me. Still, I retreated inside and double-checked the lock on the door. As I lay in the musty bed, a long, mournful howl echoed through the night. Probably just a wolf or coyote, I thought. Pulling the covers tight, I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I awoke with a start. Pale light filtered through the grimy windows. Morning already? Had I really slept that long? I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A shuffling, snuffling sound coming from below the floorboards. Some animal must have gotten into the crawl space, a raccoon or possum probably. I'd have to check it out. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a jacket, and went out into the chilly morning air. This drifted between the trees, catching the slanting sunlight. Dew soaked my jeans as I knelt to peer into the cabin. The crawl space was about 3 feet high, just a bare dirt expanse supported by rotting wooden beams. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the gloom. I could still hear the shuffling. Then I spotted it. A shadowy shape about 20 feet in, but it looked too big to be a raccoon. Just then the shape turned. 2 glowing amber eyes stared straight at me. A chill ran down my spine. Those were not the eyes of any raccoon. They almost looked human. The thing lurched forward with unnatural speed. Shit, I scrambled backward, cracking my head on the edge of the cabin. By the time I staggered to my feet, wherever it was had vanished into the depths of the crawl space. My heart pounded. What the hell had I just seen? Part of me wanted to just jump in the car and get far away from this forest. But I took a deep breath. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. There had to be a logical explanation. I spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the cabin as best I could, shoving an old bookcase against the trapdoor door to the crawl space, making sure all the windows were locked tight. It helped me feel a bit more secure, though I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling of being watched from the woods. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself with a hike. The forest no longer felt peaceful, but dark and ominous, full of unseen threats. An icy tingle crept up my back. I couldn't shake the sense that something was stalking me just out of sight behind the trees. Branches seemed to reach for me like grasping claws. As dusk fell, I hurried back to the cabin. The windows were like pitch-black mirrors reflecting the last blood-red rays of sun. I thought I glimpsed a dark bipedal silhouette flitting between the trees, but when I turned to look, it was gone inside. I then bolted the door and collapsed onto the couch, jumping at every nighttime sound. What had I got myself into by coming out here? My uncle's warning echoed in my head. The woods can play tricks on you, especially at night. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there really something out there? Against my better judgment, I dug out my phone. No service, of course. With a sigh, I retrieved my uncle's ancient laptop from my bag, time to find out if those local legends were just stories or something more. Fortunately, my uncle had downloaded a bunch of information on the area before my trip. Time to find out the truth about what lurked in these woods. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, the laptop balanced on my knees, and started digging through articles my uncle had saved. One jumped out at me, Dogman of northern Wisconsin. I felt a tingle on the back of my neck as I started reading. The article described a cryptozoological creature said to roam the forest of Wisconsin, particularly the northern region where I was staying. Witnesses reported a beast that walked upright like a man, but had the head of a wolf or dog. It was described as tall, powerfully built, with shaggy fur and glowing amber eyes. Some even claimed it had human-like hands tipped with razor-sharp claws. Sightings dated back decades, with hotspots near my exact location in Nicola National Forest. Loggers, hunters, campers all had stories of seeing the creature, hearing its blood-curdling howls, and finding its massive three-toed tracks. Many were convinced it was real, not just a legend. As I read on, a creeping horror sunk its claws into me. The creature I glimpsed under the cabin, the glowing eyes, the hulking shape, the unnatural speed, it all lined up too well with the descriptions of the Dogman. Had I really seen this mythical monster, or just an illusion born of isolation and paranoia? I slammed the laptop shut and pressed my palms against my eyes. Think rationally, I told myself. Creatures like that didn't really exist. There had to be some other explanation for what I saw, for the sounds and sensations that haunted me. If I gave in to superstitious fear, I knew better than the backwoods folk who believed in this Dogman legend. I spent a restless night trying to convince myself. It was all in my head. But when I examined the crawl space in the morning light, my blood ran cold. There in the soft dirt were a set of large, fresh tracks, 3 long clawed toes. Just like the witnesses had described, it was too much legend or not. Something was stalking the woods around this cabin. I had to get out of here. I threw my stuff in my backpack, my hands shaking. I'd hike out to the trailhead where I'd parked the car. I could still make it back to Chicago before dark if I hurried, but as I reached for the doorknob, a horrific howl split the air just beyond the walls. I froze. Through the window, I glimpsed a massive shape moving between the trees, far too fluid to be a bear. A cold sweat trickled down my back. The thing paced back and forth at the tree line, letting out another unearthly howl. It was as if it knew I was about to flee and was calling to its brethren like it was toying with me, relishing my terror. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own cabin, my hands balled into fists. To hell with this. I thought, if this Dogman wanted a fight, it would get one. I grabbed my uncle's old hunting knife and his shotgun that I'd found in the closet. If I was going down, I'd go down swinging. The time for doubt and disbelief was over. I watched through a crack in the curtains as the beast prowled between the trees, its shape disturbingly human in posture and movement, but it was far larger than any man, with shaggy dark fur and a wolf-like head. I caught glimpses of curved claws and a bushy tail. It was like something out of a nightmare. As I observed its behavior, a chilling realization crept over me. This thing wasn't just some mindless animal or abomination. There was an uncanny intelligence in the way it moved. The way its eerie amber eyes seemed to be cataloging every detail of the cabin and surroundings. What did it want? Hours ticked by in tense silence. The creature never strayed far, circling the clearing. It was playing the long game, waiting for me to make a move. As the shadows lengthened, my mind spun into dark places. The financial stress, the relationship troubles that had driven me out here, they all seemed so distant and trivial. Now I gladly take a mountain of debt and a messy breakup over being besieged by an unknown monstrosity. With evening approaching, I knew I couldn't just sit here forever. I'd have to make a break for it. I loaded the old shotgun, stuffed the knife in my belt, and shrugged on my backpack. One way or another, this ended tonight. Before I could lose my nerve, I burst out the front door into the clearing shotgun. At the ready, a startled snarl erupted from the trees to my right. I mobbed and loosed a shot at a dark shape ducking behind a large trunk. In the muzzle flash, I saw a furred limb, a clawed hand paw. The shot splintered bark, but the creature was already gone, moving with blinding speed. I took off in the opposite direction, crashing through underbrush toward the trail. Branches clawed at my face and clothes. My heart felt like it would explode. From behind me came the sounds of snapping twigs and heavy footfalls. It was pursuing me. Of course it was. The trail was up ahead, a pale ribbon in the gathering dusk. If I could just reach it, then it was a straight shot to the car. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was bounding after me on all fours, covering ground at a terrifying rate. I saw its powerful limbs rippling beneath matted fur, its jaw hanging open to reveal a blood-red tongue lolling between yellow fangs. I hit the trail, lungs screaming, legs churning. Only a quarter-mile to the trailhead, the forest blurred on either side of me. Blood roared in my ears, but beneath it all, I could hear the thing's panting breaths as it closed, the distance getting closer and closer. 100 yards from the parking lot, my toe snagged a root and I went sprawling face first into the dirt. The shotgun flew from my grip and I tasted blood behind me. I heard the creature skid to a halt. A deep rumbling growl vibrated through my body. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, feeling its hot breath on the back of my neck. Trembling, I rolled over and stared straight into the glowing amber eyes of the beast. Its lips were peeled back in a snarl, its muzzle mere inches from my face. I could smell the carrion reek of its breath. It placed a clawed hand paw on my chest, pinning me to the ground. Intelligent eyes bored into mine as if daring me to move. I knew I should be terrified, but in that moment, I was transfixed by the raw, ancient power of the being. For a stretched second, we remained locked in that macabre tableau. Then the pressure on my chest eased. The creature stepped back, still holding my gaze without breaking eye contact. It raised its muzzle to the sky and let out a long, mournful howl that echoed off the trees and mountains. The hairs on my neck stood up. There was something undeniably sorrowful in the sound. In the next heartbeat, the creature turned and leapt off into the darkening forest, leaving me shaking and bewildered on the trail. I laid there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally climbed to my feet, I had the unshakable sense that the creature had been trying to tell me something, that it had let me go for a reason. But I stumbled the last few yards to my old hatchback, hands still shaking. After my encounter on the trail, all I wanted was to get as far away from those woods as I could. But as I fumbled with my keys, I paused. My backpack with my uncle's laptop was still hanging off one shoulder. The photos, the articles about previous dogman sightings. Suddenly I was struck with the disturbing thought, what if I wasn't the first person the creature had confronted this way? What if there was a pattern to its behavior that could hint at its true nature or motivations? I'd only skimmed a fraction of the information my uncle had collected. With a sigh, I tossed my backpack in the passenger seat. It looked like I wouldn't be putting this behind me just yet. As I sped down the dirt logging road, the dark forest whizzed by outside the cracked windows. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature loping after me. But there was nothing. The woods had fallen, still no sign of the unnatural presence that had been stalking me. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that I was still involved in something I didn't fully understand. The creature had deliberately let me go, and I needed to find out why. As soon as I reached the highway, I pulled over and dug out the laptop, hands still trembling slightly. Time to dive deeper down this rabbit hole and uncover the truth about the Dogman. I plodded over the articles and accounts for hours, cross-referencing details. The picture began to emerge, as disturbing as it was fascinating. This was not the first time the Dogman had interacted with a human in this manner, stalking them, scaring them, but ultimately letting them go. In fact, such behavior was sprinkled throughout the lore. One logger in the 1980s reported the creature terrorizing his campsite for days, only to pin him down one night, stare into his eyes, and then melt back into the forest. A hiker in the 90s described an almost identical encounter to mine, right down to the mournful howl. There are other stories too, whispers and legends of the Dogman guarding the forest, punishing those who disrespected it. A thought seized me, as cold and stark as the lunar light washing over the forest. What if the Dogman wasn't just a predator, but a protector, an ancient guardian of these primordial woods, warding off threats and trespassers? Had I offended it in some way, triggered some defense of its territory? I thought back to my first careless night at the cabin, the can of beer I'd tossed into the brush, the branch I'd hacked off for firewood. Little things, but things that showed no respect for the forest. Maybe that's what had drawn the creature's attention, and its ire pieces were falling into place, but it still did explain why it had let me go in the end. If I transgressed, why not finish me off? Unless it was less a punishment than a warning. A message to take back to the wider world. I shivered, and it had nothing to do with the nighttime chill. I knew then what I had to do. I had to go back into those woods and face the Dogman one last time. I had to understand what it wanted from me, and I couldn't let fear stop me. I took a deep breath in the sharp piney air, steeling myself I'd come to these woods to prove something to myself. Now accidentally, I'd have to prove something to the creature that ruled them. The small parking lot was deserted when I pulled in just before dawn. A low mist hung over the treetops, stained pale orange by the rising sun. The forest was waking up, a dawn chorus of birdsong echoing beneath the pines. It seemed almost too idyllic after the horrors of the previous night, but I knew better now. I hoisted my backpack, now stuffed with a few supplies, and set off down the trail at a brisk clip. I had a general idea of where I needed to go, and I wanted to get there before I lost my nerve. The creature had held an intelligence in its gaze that I couldn't shake. If it truly was some kind of guardian of the forest, then the heart of its territory would be deep in the oldest part of the woods, where the trees grew close and thick. The trail quickly faded out, leaving me to navigate through the dense underbrush. Low branches snagged at my hair and clothes. The air grew heavy and close, laden with the smells of earth and decay. Despite the golden rays slanting through the canopy, a deep gloom settled over the forest floor. As I trekked deeper into the primordial woods, a strange sensation came over me. The modern world felt distant, unreal. Out here in the domain of the Dogman, older rules held sway. I found myself slipping into an almost meditative rhythm, my senses hyper-attuned to my surroundings. I don't know how long I walked, hours probably, or time seemed to warp and stretch beneath the ancient trees. The woods had a watchful quality, as if the forest itself was alive and aware. I knew I was getting close. I could feel it in my bones. Then the trees opened up into a small clearing, dominated by a towering white pine. The air practically thrummed with a wild ancient energy. I knew with unshakable certainty that I had reached the heart of the Dogman's territory. I walked to the center of the clearing, knelt down, and set my backpack aside. Reaching within, I deliberately pulled out the empty beer can I carelessly tossed my first night at the cabin. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Slowly, solemnly, I began to dig a small hole in the loamy soil. As I laid the crumpled can to rest and covered it with rich black earth, I felt an old heaviness start to lift from my spirit. This was an apology, a gesture of respect for the wilderness I had ignorantly violated. A twig snapped at the edge of the clearing. My head snapped up, and there it was, the dogman watching me from between the trees. In the daylight, I could see its features clearly. Shaggy fur, lupine snout, intelligent amber eyes. I stood slowly, hands open and unthreatening. The creature padded forward until we were face to face. Ancient being, immortal man. Its eyes bored into mine, searching, appraising. I held its gaze, pouring all my regret and newfound understanding into that look. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the guardian of the forest. "You'll do better." Something shifted in its expression, a softening around those wild eyes. Then it dipped its great shaggy head, slowly and deliberately. A noble acknowledgement, message sent and received. In the next heartbeat, the dogman turned and loped off into the trees, vanishing like a shadow. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the mysterious, untamed essence of the forest. When I finally made my way back to civilization, I was not the same man who had fled these woods in terror the night before. The forest and its enigmatic guardian had marked me, changed me, and I knew without a doubt that no matter where I went or what troubles I faced, a part of me would always belong to these ancient primordial woods. The financial woes, the relationship struggles that had driven me out here felt manageable now. Challenges to be faced head-on rather than run from, because I had seen true wildness, looked it in the eyes, and made my peace with it. Everything else was just details. As the lights of the city rose to greet me, one final howl lifted from the distant forest, mournful, primal knowing. A reminder that the wilderness is always there, waiting for those who need to remember their place in the old ways of the world. The broken branches crunched under my boots as I made my way deeper into the shadowy forest. Beads of sweat trickled down my neck in the humid July air. The straps of my heavy backpack dug into my shoulders, but I trudged onward, desperate to put more distance between myself and the messy life I was fleeing in Seattle. As a 28-year-old web designer drowning in credit card debt, I was in dire need of a reset. The daily grind of client calls, impending deadlines, and past due notices had whittled me down to a shell of my former self. I longed for escape, for a chance to unplug from the digital hell that my life had become. So I set out for the Olympic National Forest, seeking solace among the towering Douglas firs and jagged peaks. I had fond childhood memories of summer camping trips with my family, roasting marshmallows, swimming in glacial lakes, pointing out constellations in the inky night sky. I craved a return to that blissful simplicity. After hours of hiking, my leaden legs carried me into a shaded glen. Shafts of golden daylight pierced the dense canopy, dappled the forest floor in an emerald patchwork. The earthy scent of pine needles and loamy soil filled my lungs. A crystal-clear stream cut across my path. Its cheerful babbling was a balm to my frayed nerves. This looked like an ideal spot to make camp for the night. I unslunged my pack and busied myself, gathering, kindling, the repetitive task lulling me into a meditative rhythm. Once I had a respectable pile of twigs and branches, I set about constructing a basic lean-to from a tarp and paracord. The snug shelter would offer some protection from the elements and any curious wildlife. Exhausted from the day's exertions, I crawled inside and stretched out on top of my sleeping bag. My eyelids grew heavy as I listened to the wind whisper through the boughs overhead. Sleep soon overtook me and I drifted off, surrendering to the forest's primordial lullaby. But my slumber was shattered by a piercing howl that ripped through the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding against my ribcage. A haunting cry echoed through the trees. Closer this time, it sounded like no animal I had ever heard before. A chilling blend of lupine and human ice flooded my veins as realization dawned. I was not alone in these woods. Something was out there, something unnatural, and it knew exactly where I was. The eerie howls continued to reverberate through the inky forest. I huddled in my flimsy shelter, too petrified to move. My mind raced through the possibilities of what ungodly creature could be lurking among the shadows. Bears, wolves. The primal vocalizations sounded vaguely canine, but with an intelligent, almost human-like cadence that defied explanation. I had heard whispers around campfires, dark tales shared in hushed tones, of things that stalked the untamed wilds of the Pacific Northwest. Things that walked on two legs and hungered for human flesh. The Windwalker, the Midnight Whistler, the Boggy Creek Monster. Mere legends. I had always scoffed old wives' tales and urban myths. Nothing more. But now, hunkered down in this godforsaken stretch of wilderness, I wasn't so sure. Fear has a way of making you question everything you thought you knew. With a trembling hand, I fished my cell phone out of my pocket. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest tower, cut off from any chance of rescue. I cursed myself for not investing in a satellite phone or emergency beacon before setting out on this misguided quest for tranquility. The snapping of branches underfoot made me freeze, phone slipping from my clammy fingers. Heavy footfalls drawing closer with each thunderous beat of my heart. The shadow fell across the tarp and I could make out a hulking silhouette, at least 8 feet tall. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. Sweat soaked through my shirt as my body. Heat rose with the tide of terror coursing through me. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the figure paused outside my makeshift refuge. A wet snuffle reached my ears, accompanied by a low, menacing growl that made my blood run cold. It sounded massive, feral, ravenous. I squeezed my eyes shut, mumbling desperate prayers to a god I wasn't sure I still believed in. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. But the relief was short-lived. An agonized human scream tore through the night, echoing off the mountains. The kind of scream that could only mean one thing, a swift and violent end. The ill scorched the back of my throat. My muscles seized with pure, unadulterated dread. I fought the urge to bolt from my hiding place and make a mad dash through the forest. Some primal instinct warned that Tehran would only attract the attention of the hungry predator. So I lay there in the claustrophobic dark, listening to the awful quiet that settled over the glen, punctuated by the erratic hammering of my pulse in my ears. Exhaustion finally defeated adrenaline, and I sank into a fitful sleep plagued by visions of gleaming fangs and gore-streaked muzzles. Ash and daylight seeped through the tarp, rousing me from my restless slumber. For a few blissful seconds, I forgot the horrors of the previous night. But reality came crashing down as I spotted the muddy footprints that encircled my shelter, footprints that were far too large to belong to any natural animal. I had two options: stay put and pray that the creature didn't return, or pack up and try to hike my way out of its territory. The latter seemed marginally less suicidal if I could just make it back to the trailhead. I shoved my backpack onto my shoulders, trying to ignore how the straps felt like a noose around my neck. Every rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird made me flinch. My nose stretched tighter than piano wires. I followed the stream downhill, figuring it had to empty into a river or lake eventually. As I slogged through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation of being watched, hostile eyes tracking my every step from the dappled shadows. Branches clawed at my face and snagged in my hair. As I picked up my pace, my boots thudding against the spongy earth, my breaths came shorter and faster, but I didn't dare slow down. The babbling of the stream grew louder, spurring me onward. It had to be close now, but when I bossed through a wall of shrubbery, I skidded to a halt at the scene that greeted me. The stream emptied into a reed-choked pond, its surface mirror flat and black as tar. Deer bones and antlers littered the muddy banks, some old and sun-bleached, others new, with shreds of sinew still clinging to them. A reeking odor of decay hung thick in the air. It was a killing ground, an open-air abattoir for the vicious predators that called this forest home, and I had just stormed into it like a lamb to the slaughter. My stomach clenched and I doubled over, retching up the meager contents of my gut. I tried to get my bearings to formulate a plan, but my panic-fogged brain refused to cooperate. I sank to my knees in the gore-streaked mud, a helpless sob tearing from my throat. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? Just yesterday I had been a carefree 20-something, my biggest concerns paying down my visa bill and dealing with demanding clients. Now I was lost in a literal monster's den, my life hanging by the most fragile of threads. Despair wrapped its icy fingers around my heart and squeezed. No one knew where I was. No one would be coming to save me. I was utterly hopeless alone. A twig snapped in behind me and I whirled around, scrambling backward in the muck. The creature emerged from the tree line, ducking under low-hanging branches with two fluid gestures. It was a nightmarish hybrid of animal and man. Powerfully muscled limbs were encased in shaggy black fur tapering to wickedly curved claws. A barrel chest heaved with each breath, straining against a filthy patchwork of clothing that might have once belonged to unlucky campers. But it was the head that froze me in my tracks. A lupine skull with malevolent amber eyes and a long snout lined with jagged fangs. The dogman had found me and it looked ravenous. The beast stalked toward me, moving with a predator's easy confidence. Drill glistened on its jagged teeth as its lips peeled back in a feral snarl. It uttered a guttural growl that made my bones vibrate. I tried to scramble backward, but my hands slid in the muck, pitching me onto my back. The mud's icy fingers seeped through my shirt as I gasped lungs of fetid air. The creature loomed over me, blocking out the watery sun. Its bulk was staggering, more massive than any wolf or bear. Time dilation stretched the moment into agonizing slow motion. Thoughts of my loved ones, of all the things left undone and unsaid, flickered through my mind like a morbid highlight reel. I saw my mom's kind smile, my sister's sparkling eyes, my best friend's booming laugh. Tears streaked down my cheeks, carving hot trails through the grime. Please. I choked out, throwing up a trembling hand as if that could ward off the hulking monstrosity. The dogman lunged with shocking speed, jaws snapping closed on empty air. I rolled to the side on pure instinct, claws raked my shoulder, shredding fabric and skin white. Hot pain exploded through me and I screamed. Somehow I managed to get my feet under me, staggering off in a blind panic. Reeds slashed at my face. As I plunged into the stagnant shallows of the pond, the water dragged at my boots, threatening to pull me under. Behind me, I could hear the creature splashing closer, snarling with rage. My hip bumped something hard, and I glanced down to see a sunken log, waterlogged and slimy with algae. Desperate, I groped along its length until my fingers closed around a knobby branch. With a cry, I tore it free of the rotting trunk. Just as the dogman pounced, we went down in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Frigid water closed over my head. Fangs sank into my forearm, and I felt the bones splinter. My agonized howl came out as a mouthful of foul-tasting bubbles. The monster shook me like a rag doll, trying to tear the arm from its socket. Agony rolled through me in nauseating waves. My grip tightened on the splintered branch, and with the last of my strength, I swung it up to smash against the beast's skull once, twice, 3 times, until its jaws loosened and inky blood bloomed in the churning water. I wrenched free from its slackened grasp and floundered through the reeds. choking on pond scum in my own terror. The creature's enraged bellows shook the trees as it gave chase, but this time I had a head start born of desperation and adrenaline. By some miracle, I dragged myself up the opposite embankment and back into the relative shelter of the trees. I crashed through the undergrowth, slipping on exposed roots, thorny vines shredding my clothing. I could feel hot blood seeping through the makeshift tourniquet of my shredded shirt. The snarls and thudding footfalls grew fainter behind me, and I realized with a hysterical bark of laughter that perhaps the creature was just as eager to avoid the stinking pond as I was. But still I ran, the pain in my mangled arm fading under the onslaught of endorphins and shock. I didn't stop until my foot caught on a buried stone and sent me sprawling face first onto the carpet of moldering leaves. I lay there gulping like a landed fish too spent to rise. The stench of my own fear, sweat mingled with the coppery tang of blood. Eventually, the need to keep moving overrode the desire to just give up. I was in the deepest heart of the forest, where ancient trees coiled into a canopy that blocked out nearly all sunlight. In every direction, the landscape looked exactly the same, an endless expanse of gnarled trunks and dense thickets. I was well and truly lost, injured, defenseless, and the monster was still out there. The only question was how long I could evade it before exhaustion betrayed me, but I was far from ready to lay down and die. Grim determination hardened in my guts. I would fight tooth and nail for every breath, right up until the bitter end. Picking a direction at random, I stumbled onward into the gloom, hoping against hope that I was heading toward civilization and not just deeper into the dogman's territory. Either way, I knew I was in for the longest night of my life. The sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding crimson and violet hues across the sky. Indigo shadows pooled between the trees, creeping across the forest floor like spilled ink. Night fell swiftly this deep in the Olympic wilds. Night meant one terrifying thing: the hunter would have the advantage. As the last of the meager light faded, I was struck by the suffocating silence. No scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush, no hooting of owls or chirping of crickets. It seemed as if every living thing in these woods knew to make itself scarce after nightfall. Every living thing except me. Each rasping breath and crunching footfall sounded obscenely loud in my ears, amplified by the lack of ambient noise. I imagined the dogman perking up at the sound, his lips skinning back from yellowed fangs in a diabolical grin, anticipating the moment when its hapless prey would stumble into the range of its powerful limbs and snapping jaws, that is, if it wasn't already stalking me on silent paws. My spine prickled with the unshakable sensation of malevolent eyes boring into my back. What did they say in all those wilderness survival books? If you can see the predator, it's already too late. I shook my head angrily, trying to dispel the creeping anxiety. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not if I wanted to survive this nightmare. I had to keep my wits sharp and my senses heightened. Succumbing to mind-numbing terror would only get me killed that much quicker. My throat ached with the dehydration, and my stomach cramped painfully, reminding me that it had been nearly a day since I'd had anything to eat or drink. Any hope I'd had of finding my way back to the trail had evaporated as I'd slogged through miles of dense undergrowth, a terrain refusing to change. For all I knew, I was wandering in circles. All the while, my injured arm throbbed with a bone-deep ache. I could still feel the ghost of the creature's fangs buried in my flesh. My makeshift bandage was tacky with congealing blood, and I knew the wound needed treatment, but I had no means to provide it out here. Even a minor injury could prove fatal if infection set in. The darkness pressed in until it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Every skittering leaf or sighing breeze jolted me like an electric current. My imagination conjured twisted shapes crouched in the shadows, mad yellow eyes, matted fur, and gleaming claws. A branch cracked like a gunshot somewhere off to my left, and I leapt nearly out of my skin. pulse thundering in my ears. I strained to make out any other sounds of movement, but the forest had fallen deathly silent. Once more, with a trembling hand, I drew my phone from my pocket and smacked the power button. The screen flared painfully bright in the gloom, still no service bars. 12% battery remaining, 147. I stared at those numbers until they blurred, then swore viciously. Exhaustion and hopelessness crashed over me in a suffocating wave. I slumped against a tree trunk, my legs finally giving out beneath me. The rough bark clawed at my skin through my tattered shirt. As I slumped to the ground in a graceless heap, hot tears spilled down my cheeks, mingling with the layer of grime and blood already coating my face. I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all, at my own damn foolishness for venturing into these godforsaken woods alone and unprepared. What had I been thinking? That I could just run away from my problems, that a few days of connecting with nature would somehow straighten out the disaster zone my life had become. Now I was going to die out here, torn to bloody ribbons by a creature that shouldn't even exist outside of campfire tales and low-budget horror films. All because of my own stupid, selfish desire for an escape. The bitter irony was nearly laughable. A twig snapped nearby, so loud in the preternatural stillness that I flinched violently enough to bash my already aching head against the tree. Then another and another, steady, purposeful, drawing closer with each pop of splintering wood. I shoved my fist against my mouth, biting down on my knuckles until I tasted blood. Anything to stifle the hysterical sobs clawing their way up my throat. I shrank back against the tree, willing myself to melt into the shadows, become just another part of the forest. The footfalls halted. On the other side of my meager shelter, a dark form blotted out the faint slithers of moonlight filtering through the canopy. It was close enough to touch if I stretched out my arm, close enough to smell the reek of old blood and rancid meat on its breath. This was it, the end. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting my last sight on Earth to be those glowing amber eyes and gore-flecked maw. I pictured my parents' faces trying to draw some final crumb of comfort before the jaws closed around my throat. "I'm sorry," I breathed, voice cracking on a sob. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry." I badged myself for the white-hot agony of fangs and claws shredding my flesh, for the metallic bloom of my own blood filling my mouth as my screams faded to gurgles. But the killing strike never came. After a small eternity, I dared to open my eyes a crack. The shadow still loomed over me, eclipsing the stars, but it hadn't lunged or pounced. It just watched, steadying me with the predator's unblinking intensity.
What are you waiting for?"
I whispered, half delirious from fear and exhaustion. "Just get it over with already." The shadow huffed a sound, somewhere between a growl and a sigh. Then, to my utter disbelief, it slowly sank back on its haunches, seating itself on the carpet of leaves and pine needles a few feet away, like an oversized dog awaiting orders from its master. I gaped temporarily, forgetting to be terrified in the face of this bizarre new behavior. The creature remained motionless, though I could feel the weight of its gaze boring into me. Was it trying to communicate? Did it want something from me beyond the obvious pound of flesh? The thought seemed ludicrous, like something out of a cheesy sci-fi flick. This thing was a monster, a soulless killing machine. It didn't have wants or needs beyond sating its feral bloodlust, did it? Swallowing hard, I addressed it directly, feeling only slightly ridiculous. I don't understand. What do you want?" The dog man tempted its massive head, jaws parting slightly. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might actually answer, but instead it stretched out one clawed hand, paw, and gingerly set something on the ground between us. I squinted momentarily, baffled. It looked like a hunk of raw, bloody meat. The cloying stench of offal made my gorge rise, and I started to turn away in revulsion. But then I caught sight of the scrap of bright fabric still clinging to the glistening red mass. With a jolt of pure, sickening horror, I realized I was looking at the torn remnants of a yellow rain jacket. child-sized rain jacket, I'll seared the back of my throat as understanding crashed over me in a nauseating wave. It wasn't just deer that the creature had been preying on. It had killed and was still killing human beings, men, women, children. So many torn and broken bodies lay scattered throughout this forest, waiting to be stumbled upon by horrified hikers. How long had this monster been stalking these woods, glutting itself on the flesh of the unwary? Ember-bright eyes bored into me, unblinking, expectant. Slowly, horribly, it began to dawn on me what the dogman wanted. It was trying to feed me like a wolf providing for its pups. It had brought me an offering from its most recent kill, but the implications of that were too terrible to contemplate. If the creature saw me as keen as something to be nurtured rather than devoured, I didn't have time to finish the thought before an ear-splitting crack rent the air. The dogman lurched to its feet with a savage roar, whirling to face the disturbance. More cracks followed, sharp and percussive, and my stunned brain finally registered what I was hearing: gunshots. Someone was shooting at the monster. Voices reached my ringing ears. Male, rough with age, flavored with a hint of the local accent. They were shouting, calling to each other as they crashed through the underbrush. The beams of powerful flashlights split the darkness, sweeping through the trees like searchlights. "God damn it, Lester," someone shouted. "You missed." "I ain't missed. I winged the bastard." "Look, it's blighting." "Less John. More shooting. It's getting away." The dogman snarled in fury and launched itself toward the voices and the assault rifles they carried. More gunfire erupted, strobing through the night, and human howls of pain and rage shook the boughs. I saw my chance and took it. Bolting from my hiding place, I plunged into the forest in the opposite direction of the cacophony. Branches whipped at my face and caught at my clothes, but I barely felt them. I ran like the devil himself was on my heels, which wasn't too far off the mark. At my back, the sounds of pursuit faded beneath the staccato boom of gunshots and bestial roars. Guttural human curses mingled with splintering wood and meaty thwacks. The would-be hunters had become the hunted, and I had a sick feeling. I know which side would emerge victorious. But as the miles fell away behind my pounding feet, a new thought crept unbidden into my mind. More terrible than any monster, the men hadn't been government agents or forest rangers, just local hunters, likely out for a weekend of deer stalking and beer swilling. Good old boys from the backwoods, armed with more ammo and bravado than sense. And they had known about the creature, recognized it on sight. They'd set out tonight with a specific target in mind, which could only mean one thing: the rumors were true. The locals knew that the Dogman legend was more than just a tall tale spun around campfires. They'd known for years, maybe generations, and they'd kept it secret. Let hapless outsiders like me go on believing we were safe within national park boundaries until we disappeared down the gullet of an all-too-real nightmare. Cold fury crystallized in my gut, tempering my terror into something hard and sharp. Enough was enough. I was done being this thing's prey, this town's sacrificial lamb. Asher Reynolds might have hiked into these woods a spineless yuppie, but by God, he wasn't hiking out one. I would find a way to stop this creature, expose the ugly truth festering in the forest's diseased heart. Whatever it took, however long I had to fight, this ended now. With grim resolve, I turned my feet toward civilization and safety, silently declaring war on the monsters, both human and otherwise, that had made these mountains their stalking ground. They had no idea what was coming for them. The trees began to thin, grudgingly giving way to scraggly underbrush and spongy turf. My heart leapt at the first flash of movement that didn't belong to a nocturnal predator. Up ahead, the wan glow of headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom. Car engines rumbled over birdsong, accompanied by the crunch of tires on gravel. The trailhead. I'd done it. I'd survived. Sheer relief surged through me, chased by a dizzying rush of exhaustion as the adrenaline that had sustained my battered body through the night drained away. I half ran, half staggered, toward the promised daylight, uncaring of the branches that snagged my hair and sliced my cheeks like icy razors. I burst from the tray line into a scene of carefully cultivated cheer. A small dirt lot bordered by cheerful signage welcoming visitors to the Olympic National Forest, complete with faded cartoon mascots. The contrast with the primordial horrors lurking beyond the trail markers was dizzying, obscene. A few vehicles were parked in haphazard angles, some still idled. Sleepy-looking campers milled around them, nursing steaming cups of coffee and making final checks of their gear before setting off. So ordinary, so banal, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis, as if they weren't unwittingly walking into the hunting grounds of a living nightmare. I must have made quite a sight. Lurching into their midst, my clothes were filthy and ripped, my skin scored with countless cuts and bruises, one arm hanging at a nauseating angle. From the wide-eyed stares and nervous muttering, I gathered that I looked every bit the crazed mountain man from the gas station's gory tales. "Help!" I croaked in a voice rusted from dehydration and overuse. "Please, I need help." For a moment, no one moved. Then a matronly woman in a fleece jacket broke from the knot of wary onlookers and hurried toward me with motherly concern creasing her features. "Oh, you poor thing. What on earth happened to you? Were you attacked by an animal here?" She guided me to a weathered picnic bench and I collapsed onto it gratefully, my muscles screaming. Now that I'd stopped moving, a bone-deep ache was setting in. The precursor to a pain that I knew would be beyond description. The woman pressed a water bottle into my trembling hand and I gulped at it greedily, heedless of the rivulets that ran down my chin. The group was clustering around now in tight, anticipatory silence. They knew something was very wrong, that my wounds went beyond a simple hiking accident. They just didn't want to be the first to say it aloud. "You need to call the Rangers," a man's voice interjected as I came up for air, "and maybe the police. This guy looks like he tangled with a lot more than a bear." I knew what I tangled with, I said, raising my voice so they could all hear. No more beating around the bush. It was time to yank the elephant into the room, kicking and screaming. It was the dog man, the lunar beast they call it sometimes. 7, 8 feet tall, jaws like a steel trap, claws like cut glass, walked on 2 legs, but sure as shit wasn't human. It killed. I swallowed thickly, unwanted images of shredded yellow fabric dancing behind my eyes. It killed everything that crossed its path, deer, rabbits, people, silence. And the whispering started like the hiss of a fuse burning down. I caught snatches here and there. Crazy shock, get a grip before he snaps. But I also saw the faces of the older campers, the ones who'd grown up in the area. They had paled beneath their weathered tans and they weren't meeting my wild eyes. They knew, of course. They knew I'm not crazy. I said louder. No anger was rising in me, a righteous burn, and I'm not in shock. You know it's out there. You've known for a hell of a long time. Maybe you've even covered up the disappearances, the bodies that didn't make it home to their families. How could you let this go on? The crowd rippled, uneasily and almost guilty undercurrent running through them, but still no one spoke up, cowards to the last. "Well," I gritted out from between clenched teeth. "I won't be silent. I'm trying to tell everyone what's really lurking in these mountains, the news, social media, anyone who listened. No more hikers are going to die because they didn't know to be afraid of the dark." "Now, son," one grizzled old-timer began, his face a mask of condescension and pity. "I know you think you saw something out there, but you're not well. You're rambling about legends and conspiracy theories, and that arm looks infected. Let's get you to a hospital." My laughter was brittle, edging toward hysteria. "Oh, I'm going to a hospital, all right. And I'm going to show them exactly what bit me. They'll all see who's rambling." I turned to the crowd at large, seeing the uncertainty and and fear in their eyes. Good, about time they felt a piece of what had been clawing at my sanity all night long. This ends now. I declared, my ragged voice ringing with conviction. No more secrets, no more cover-ups. The world needs to know the truth about what stalks these woods after dark, and if you won't help me expose it, then stay the hell out of my way. With that, I leveraged myself upright, wobbling only slightly as the last of my flagging strength threatened to desert me entirely. I fixed the gawking onlookers with a final flinty glare before turning on my heel and limping toward the parking lot. Behind me, the buzz of conversation swelled like an agitated hive. Let them gossip and speculate. By the time I was done, the existence of the dog man would be an undisputed fact. Not just a campfire story to be dismissed by the willfully ignorant. I spotted an unattended SUV with my other cars in John Deere and a camouflage steering wheel cover visible through the window. Bingo. Exactly the kind of vehicle a weekend warrior who fancied himself the next Davy Crockett would drive. Ignoring the inferno of pain singing through my nerves, I staggered to the car and wrenched open the passenger door. As I'd hoped, a small duffel bag emblazoned with some outdoor supply company's logo sat on the seat. I pawed through it one-handed, scattering granola bars and hand warmers until my fingers brushed against the smooth cylindrical body of a satellite phone. Hey, what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing? I looked up to see a man with an impressive beard and a faded NRA cap bearing down on me. His pot-bellied belly straining against a red flannel shirt. His expression was a thundercloud of righteous indignation right up until he got a good look at my mangled arm and blood-crusted face. Then it morphed into something closer to shocked horror. "Borrowing this?" I replied, brandishing the sat phone. "I'll give it back once I've called in the cavalry. If you've got half a brain, you'll get back in your car and get as far away from these woods as the wheels can take you." He gaped at me a moment longer, clearly torn between defending his property and putting as much distance as possible between himself and the wild-eyed lunatic raving about monsters. Self-preservation won out, and he scrambled back without another word, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to retreat. I punched in the first number that came to mind, the one drilled into my head since grade school night. The line clicked and hissed as the sat phone struggled to find a reliable signal through the dense tree cover. For a few agonizing seconds, I thought the call wouldn't connect. Then a blessedly human voice crackled to life, professionally crisp. "What's your emergency?" "My name is Asher Reynolds," I said, enunciating each word with care, so there could be no mistaking my intent. "I'm at the White River Campground off Highway 410, and I need to report a murder, multiple murders going back years, maybe decades, all covered up by the locals." A pause ripe with confusion and burgeoning unease. "Sir, what do you mean by covered up? Are you in any immediate danger? Are you injured?" "We'll explain everything to the police when I get here," I replied, injecting steel into my tone. "They better come armed for more than a bear, and tell them to bring body bags. They're going to need them once they start searching these woods." I said, "Sir, I don't quite understand. Are you saying there's some kind of serial killer in the area? Do you need medical attention? Just send everyone you've got." I stepped weariness and pain, sharpening my words into barbs, cops, rangers, federal agents, a goddamn army battalion. I want this place locked down and crawling with search parties within the hour. No one else is going to be a dogman's shoe toy on my watch. I could practically hear her bafflement, but to her credit, the operator didn't demand further clarification. "Units are being dispatched to your location now, sir. Please stay on the line with me until they arrive. Are you somewhere safe?" I laughed, a dry, hollow sound, utterly devoid of humor. I looked out over the Posset parking lot, the mingling cluster of concerned campers, sun-dappled tree line that seemed so benign in the lightning dawn somewhere beyond that emerald veil of forest. beast was licking its wounds, yellow eyes ablaze with fury and hunger, already anticipating its next kill. "Lady, none of us have been safe since we've set foot in this park," I said softly. "That changes today. I'm ending this. One way or another, the dogman's reign of terror is over, and as I heard the first distant wail of sirens splitting the morning calm, I knew I meant every word. This was a declaration of war, and damn the casualties. The Olympic National Forest would run red with retribution before I was done. No one else will fall prey to the nightmare that has stalked these mountains for far too long. It was time for the hunters to become the hunted, and I would be the one leading the charge. The dogman had messed with the wrong yuppie. The encounter I'm about to describe happened to me just under 2 years ago. In the summer of I was 23 years old at the time, working as a delivery truck driver in the small town of Millfield. I had been dating a girl named Jenna for about 6 months when her family decided to move across the country to California for her dad's new job. Jenna wanted to try to make the long-distance relationship work, despite my reservations. I had attempted long distance once before in college and it crashed and burned spectacularly. But I cared about Jenna and wanted to give it a shot for her sake. During our 6 months together, Jenna had flown out to visit me in Millfield a few times. This particular story took place during one of those visits in late June. Jenna was going to stay with me for about 10 days before the big move. I had requested the full week off work to spend time with her, but unfortunately due to staffing issues, I was only able to get a few of the days off, including that Friday. I woke up that Friday morning around 4:30 a.m. Same as always, my internal body clock was permanently set to trucker time. I lived in a dingy basement apartment with my childhood buddy Mike at the time. It wasn't much to look at, but the rent was dirt cheap. It suited our bachelor lifestyle just fine. As I stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness that morning to head to my truck, something odd caught my eye. Directly across the street from our building stood a decrepit old church that looked like it dated back to the 1800s. Peeling brown paint, brittle wooden shingles, the works. It had one of those tall bell towers with a steep pitched roof capping it off. In all the time I had lived there, I had never once seen a single soul enter or leave that building. The place gave off majorly creepy vibes. All the windows were frosted and yellowed with age, making it impossible to see inside. But on this particular morning, I noticed a faint light glowing in the top window of the bell tower. I squinted at it, puzzled. Had that light been on when Jenna and I got home late last night from the airport? I couldn't recall. I was so tired I probably wouldn't have noticed. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I hopped in my truck and headed off for my delivery route. That afternoon, with the summer sun blazing overhead, I returned home from work. The mysterious light in the bell tower was the last thing on my mind as I bounded up the steps eager to see Jenna and start our weekend together. "Hey babe," I called out as I entered the apartment. "I'm home." Jenna poked her head out of the kitchen, a big smile on her face. "Welcome back. I made us some sandwiches for lunch." As we sat down to eat, a thought suddenly popped into my head. "Hey, did you happen to notice a light on in that creepy church tower last night when we got back from the airport?" I asked. Jenna furrowed her brow. "No, I don't think so. Why was it on this morning?" I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it glowing up there in the dark when I left for work. Super weird, right? I've never seen any lights on in that place before." She considered it for a moment before shrugging. "Huh. Yeah, that is weird. Maybe someone forgot to turn it off." Something about her nonchalant response made me feel like I was overreacting. "Yeah, I'm sure that's it," I said, pushing the niggling sense of unease to the back of my mind. The church light mystery could wait. I wanted to focus on enjoying this precious time with my girlfriend before she moved away. The next few days passed by in a blur of summer fun. Shin and I went hiking, had a picnic by the lake. visited some of the kitschy local tourist traps. The more time we spent together, the more I dreaded her impending departure. Late Wednesday afternoon, we were lounging around the apartment in a food coma after going out for a big lunch. Jenna suddenly perked up with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I have an idea," she said. "What's the scariest horror movie you've ever seen?" I thought about it for a moment. Probably The Woman in Black, that old British ghost story flick with Daniel Radcliffe. I saw it in theaters with some buddies when I was like 13, and it scared the absolute shit out of me. I couldn't sleep right for a week. I said, "Perfect." Jenna replied with an impish grin. "Let's watch it tonight, then afterwards let's go investigate that light in the church tower." I stared at her incredulously. Jenna was by far the more adventurous one in our relationship, but this seemed a little nuts even for her. "You can't be serious," I said. "You really want to go poking around that creepy-ass church in the middle of the night?" "Come on, it'll be fun," she cajoled. "Where's your sense of adventure? I'm leaving in a few days. This could be like our last little thrill together." I could tell she had her heart set on this. And, truth be told, there was a part of me that was deeply intrigued, despite my trepidation. Heaving a sigh, I relented. "All right, fine. Woman in Black and a late-night church excursion. It is. But if we get attacked by a vengeful spirit, I'm blaming you." Julie just laughed and threw a couch cushion at my head. Later that night, after sunset, Jenna and I settled in on the couch to watch The Woman in Black. I felt my palms start to sweat as Daniel Radcliffe made his way across the foggy moors towards that isolated haunted house. Something about the dreary, washed-out color palette and ominous soundtrack just really got under my skin. By the time the ghostly Woman in Black made her first appearance on screen, I was thoroughly creeped out. I leaned into Jenna, thankful for the warmth and solidity of her presence. She seemed to be enjoying the movie, her eyes glued to the screen, occasionally letting out a little gasp at the jump scares. When the credits finally rolled, I sat up and stretched, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of my shoulders. Jenna turned to me with shining eyes. "That was awesome," she said, thoroughly creepy. "I can see why it freaked you out so much as a kid." She added, "No kidding," but managed to mostly block out the memory of that trauma. I joked. Then I sobered up, so I guess it's go time. Operation Investigate the Creepy Church. Jenna nodded firmly. "Yep, grab your flashlight. Let's do this." I headed to my bedroom and rummaged around in my closet until I found my heavy-duty maglite. I also discreetly tucked my Glock 19 into my waistband. I figured it probably wouldn't do much good against malevolent spirits, but you never know what kind of living, breathing whack jobs might be lurking around an abandoned church at night. Better safe than sorry. We headed out into the muggy summer darkness, making our way across the deserted street. The light was still on up in the church bell tower, casting an eerie glow against the inky black sky. My mouth felt dry as we approached one of the side windows. Up close, I could see that the window was boarded up with rotting wood planks. On a whim, I gave one of the planks an experimental tug. To my shock, it pulled away easily from the rusty nails, barely putting up a fight. Heart-pounding, I pried off a few more planks until there was a space just big enough for a person to wiggle through. Before I could second-guess myself, I hoisted myself up and threw myself through the gap, landing in a crouch on the dusty floor inside. I reached back to help Jenna clamber in after me. The musty smell of aged wood and decaying paper enveloped us as our eyes adjusted to the dimness inside the church. One moonbeam filtered in through the grimy windows, casting strange shadows across the peeling walls and piles of jumbled rummage and debris. The place looked like it hadn't been inhabited by anything other than rats and insects in decades. I clicked on my flashlight and did a slow turn, taking in our surroundings. Jenna stayed close by my side as we picked our way through the foyer area and into what must have once been the main congregation hall. Running wooden pews stretched out before us in half-collapsed rows. At the far end, I could make out the dark rectangle of a doorway that seemed to lead to the back of the church. We made our way down the aisle, the floorboards creaking and groaning underfoot like the arthritic joints of an ancient creature. When we reached the door, I turned the tarnished knob and it opened with a rusty squeal that set my teeth on edge. The narrow stairwell leading up to the bell tower unfolded before us, choked with cobwebs and shadows. The sickly yellow light filtering down through the cracks felt cold and fetid. For the first time, I found myself seriously questioning the wisdom of this little adventure, but Jenna was already moving towards the stairs with determined purpose. I had no choice but to follow, my spine tingling with every step upwards into the unknown. As we neared the top of the winding stair, I strained my ears for any sound of movement from above. All I heard was the scrabbling of tiny rodent feet and the frenzied thudding of my own pulse in my ears. We emerged into a cramped circular room at the top of the tower. By the light of my flashlight, I could see that it was crowded with moldering stacks of boxes, crates, and other assorted detritus. In there, set into one wall, was a crude wooden ladder leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling, the source of the mysterious light. I swallowed hard, battling the almost overwhelming urge to turn tail and run. But I couldn't let Jenna think I was a total wuss. Shouldering past her, I gripped the sides of the ladder and hauled myself up until my head bumped against the rough underside of the trapdoor. I hesitated for one long, gut-churning moment. Then, holding my breath, I reached up and pushed against the door with one hand. It resisted for a fraction of a second before swinging outward on rusty hinges with a keening creak that made the hair on my arm stand up. Bracing myself for God knows what, I poked my head up through the opening and blinked in surprise. The small belfry room was completely empty, apart from the dully gleaming bronze church bell hanging silently in the center. One light filtered in through the slatted openings on all four sides that looked out over the sleeping town below. And there, jammed into an old sconce on the wall, was a battered camping lantern, the source of the mysterious light. No ghostly apparitions, no hooded figures performing dark rituals. Just an old light that someone had forgotten to turn off. I found myself letting out a slightly manic laugh as I clambered up into the belfry, reaching out a hand to help Jenna up after me. We stood side by side, gazing out through the narrow gaps at the twinkling lights of Millfield laid out before us under the star-strewn sky. Well, I guess that solves that mystery, Jenna said after a moment, sounding equal parts relieved and sheepish. Here I was, all excited for a real paranormal encounter. Hey, I'm not complaining. Creepy vibes aside, this is actually a pretty rad view, I replied, draping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She nestled into my side with a contented sigh and lingered up there for a while longer, just drinking in the peaceful summer night. The adrenaline from our little amateur sleuthing mission was starting to wear off, replaced by a sleepy, languid feeling. Finally, we climbed back down the ladder and made our way out of the church the same way we come in. I did my shoddy best to hammer the boards back into place over the window while Jenna held the light. We scurried across the street and led ourselves back into my building, collapsing onto the couch in a tangle of limbs and slightly musty clothes. All things considered, that was a pretty fun night, Jenna murmured, her eyes already heavy with impending sleep. Thanks for going along with my crazy whim. As always, I smiled and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the sweet smell of her shampoo. Anytime, babe. Anytime. Later that night, or more accurately, early the next morning, I found myself in that hazy place between sleep and wakefulness. The memory of our church adventure felt simultaneously vivid and dreamlike, the details already taking on the soft edges of surreality, which was why, when I felt Jenna's urgent hand on my arm shaking me, it took me a moment to fully surface into confused alertness. "What's up?" I slurred, struggling to pry my eyelids open. John, wake up. Jenna's voice was high and thready, with barely restrained panic. Something in her tone caused a spike of icy fear to pierce through the fog of my drowsy brain. My eyes snapped open in the grainy dimness. I could just make out Jenna's wide-eyed ashen face, inches from my own. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, one trembling hand still clenched around my bicep. Her gaze wasn't on me, though. It was fixed on a shadowy corner of the room. "Jenna, what is it?" I asked, a creeping feeling of dread unfurling in my gut as I struggled upright. Her only response was to raise a shaking finger and point to the corner she was staring at, never taking her eyes off that spot. "Who's there?" she whispered. I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins, adrenaline dumping into my system. I scrambled for the bedside lamp, nearly knocking it over in my haste. With fumbling fingers, I switched it on, flooding the room with sudden harsh light, and saw nothing. The room was empty, save for the two of us. No intruders lurking in the shadows, no ghostly apparitions waiting to drag us into the abyss. Just my familiar junky bedroom, looking exactly as it always did. I turned to Jenna, opening my mouth to reassure her that she must have just had a bad dream. But the words died in my throat as I saw her face. Her eyes were closed, head lolling to the side. She was clearly fast asleep and had been the whole time. Even as I watched, she lay back down, curling into herself with a small sigh out like a light. The cold sweat prickled along my hairline as I stared down at her slumbering form, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I imagined her waking me up. Had it been some sort of insanely vivid dream within a dream? I glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. glowed at me in baleful red numbers. With a shudder, I reached over and pushed the clock further back in the drawer of my nightstand. My hands were shaking too badly to risk handling it. Sleep was certainly off the table at this point. I sat up against the headboard, switching on the TV and settling in to watch infomercials on mute until dawn. All the while, that niggling, irrational fear gnawed at me, the sense of some unseen presence watching from the shadows. I kept the lights on. The next morning, Jenna woke up looking as fresh as a daisy while I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. When I described what had happened in the night, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "I don't remember any of that," she said slowly, her brow furrowed. "I must have been really out of it. I didn't wake up at all last night." I scrubbed a hand over my face. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing, or maybe I'm just losing my mind. Jenna rubbed my back soothingly. "You've been under a lot of stress lately, with me leaving soon. It's probably just your brain working through some stuff." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the sense of unease lingered. Later that day, as we puttered around my apartment packing up Jenna's things, she suddenly paused and turned to me with a troubled expression. "You know, I had the strangest dream last night," she said haltingly. "I dreamt there was a woman standing in the corner of the bedroom, watching us. She was all in black, with long dark hair covering her face like something out of a Japanese horror movie." I felt the blood drain from my face at Jenna's words. The image she described sounded uncomfortably similar to the ghostly woman from The Woman in Black. But that was just a movie, right? A fictional story meant to scare people. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with reality. And yet the timing was undeniably eerie. Watching that film, visiting the old church, and now Jenna dreaming of a spectral woman in black mere hours later. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but deep down I knew there were no such things as coincidences. Not when it came to the supernatural. Jenna left to go back home to California. A few days later we made an effort to keep in touch, but the long distance thing took its toll, just as I'd feared it would. Within a couple of months we had drifted apart and eventually broke things off for good. I stayed in that basement apartment for a little while longer, but I never quite felt at ease there again. After that night, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every errant shadow or creak in the walls. Sleep became an elusive creature. On the nights when I finally managed to drift off, I was often plagued by unsettling dreams. Dreams of being watched by unseen eyes. Dreams of ghostly women in black with long tangled hair and grasping corpse-pale hands. In the light of day, I tried to rationalize it all away. I told myself I was just letting my imagination run away with me, spooked by too many scary movies and the power of suggestion. But in my heart of hearts, I knew that something in that old, abandoned church had attached itself to me. Some malevolent entity had followed me home that night and had no intention of letting me go. I finally ended up moving out of the apartment after my lease was up, telling myself it was because I'd found a better place across town. But if I'm being honest, I was running from whatever dark presence had sunk its claws into me ever since Jenna and I had gone poking around where we shouldn't have. Even now, 2 years later, I still find myself lying awake some nights, wondering if I truly left it behind or if it's still out there somewhere, waiting, watching, biding its time until it can drag me back into its shadows for good. I'll never know if it was the same woman in black from the movie that haunted us that night. A part of me hopes that she was just a figment of our overactive imaginations, born of too little sleep and too many scary stories. But another part of me, the part that still can't shake the bone-deep feeling of dread that washes over me whenever I think back to that summer, that part of me knows better. That part of me is sure that we looked through a doorway we were never meant to open that night, and that whatever we saw on the other side has been following me ever since, just waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting to remind me that some doors once opened can never be closed again.